Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see second part what if Quirkless Deku was abandoned and adopted by UA. Here is short summary. Abandoned when they were diagnosed quirkless, Izuku spends 5 years living on the streets, and being a vigilante, but that was an accident, mostly. Until a certain hero decides that Izuku is now his problem. Now with their new family at their side, Izuku is determined to become the world's first quirkless hero. And cause chaos along the way. Or the UA staff adopt Izuku. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. By the time they finally got to the rather large wooden door labeled Principal's Office, Izuku was thoroughly convinced that there was no corner of the school that didn't have a camera linked to it. There must have been one in the door as well, because it opened right as they got there, opening with an ominous creak that couldn't be real given the pristine state of the door. Izuku was starting to get the sense that Nezu just liked messing with people's minds. Speaking of the mammal, there he was, sitting in his chair, shuffling through some papers and sipping tea. If one didn't know of Nezu's reputation, they might think he looked relaxed. Izuku had heard enough to suspect that he was just luring them into a false sense of security. The moment that Izuku stepped into the room, his beady eyes locked onto them, and it suddenly felt like they were being dissected, each and every imperfection seen and catalogued. They were being watched like prey, and there was nowhere to hide. "Good morning, Izuku. Care for some tea?" It was phrased like they had a choice in the matter. "Good morning, Nezu-sensei." They sat down across from the mammal. Actually, come to think of it, what was Nezu? They doubted he was any of the 3 options he usually gave. They'd have to do some research tonight. They took the offered cup of tea. Aizawa spoke to Nezu before leaving to teach his class. "I know your moral compass is completely different to a human's, but keep the unethical tactics out of the lesson plan." A few papers were surreptitiously put back into drawers. "Of course, even if those are effective strategies, I understand that you humans have an aversion to manipulation." Izuku wondered exactly what was in those papers. They would be lying if they said they weren't the slightest bit curious as to what could be so horrible that Aizawa specifically mentioned not letting them learn it. Once Aizawa left, Nezu turned those soul-piercing eyes back to Izuku, and they had to suppress a fearful shiver. There were several seconds of silence. "I brought my notebooks." They had no idea what exactly Nezu wanted from them, but they seemed to have made the right decision by starting the conversation. They set the notebooks down in front of Nezu, hand hovering over them for a second of hesitance. Despite all the reassurances, they still felt like they were putting their soul into the hands of fate. They knew that if something were to happen to their notes, it would destroy them. And here they were, handing over their most precious possessions to someone who could ruin their life in a heartbeat. Excellent. Nezu flipped through the books rather quickly. Izuku eyed the pages for any damage as he continued reading. "Well, these certainly are impressive considering your age," he said, "but there are quite a few problems in how you would put this information into practical use. For example, take your entry on UQ. A lot of the weaknesses listed work theoretically, and you certainly take into account the skill level of the hero in both combat and strategy. You seem to forget that there are much simpler ways of executing the plans listed. No matter, we will have time to sort that out later. For now, reading these notes have confirmed my suspicions that if you were to continue improving, your notebooks would quickly become dangerous. Even now some of your work could cause incredible amounts of damage if it fell into the wrong hands." Izuku was stunned. Their notes might have been a bit weird, sure, but dangerous. Then again, those pages listed numerous ways to take down some high-ranking heroes. They could see how that could cause trouble, but surely their analyses weren't that good. If they were that dangerous, maybe it was a good thing no one ever took a second to read their notes. They could have accidentally hurt so many people. Nezu continued speaking, seemingly unaware of the minor mental crisis he'd caused, "Which is why I feel that you should encode your notes. I can help you create a code that is unique to you and thus far less likely to be decoded." "My own code. I suppose that makes sense. Then let's get started." The next 3 or so hours were dedicated to setting a foundation for the code, a combination of various ciphers, languages and symbols that they would have to build from. Izuku's head was swimming with all kinds of new information as they dedicated their focus to keeping up with the thought process of the smartest mammal in Japan, and even then Nedzu had to explain things a few times over for them to understand. Nedzu was officially impressed. Sure, he had suspected the child to be smart, and have the potential for more, but he certainly didn't expect how quickly they picked up on things. He was quite used to having to repeat himself numerous times when talking about a subject as complex as encryption, but Izuku somehow kept up well enough that he only had to do so a few times. It was also clear that they should have been at a much higher education level by now given how easily they understood the semi-complex math that he had to explain. He was going to have to investigate some things, namely their prior place of education, and perhaps Aizawa had some answers as to why such a bright young mind hadn't been allowed to grow. He filed that away for a later date. For now, he decided to give Izuku a break from the long process of code making before they got too overwhelmed, seeing as they were already showing signs of distress. Perhaps a little practical work. Perhaps we should stop here. Codes like this can take days if not weeks to create and longer to memorize. Until then I would advise that you stop analyzing active heroes. Nedzu could see their shoulders sag. He could read humans well enough to know that it was likely sadness at being unable to indulge in their hobby. However, it would be beneficial for you to continue to practice. I believe the third years are having some combat classes in 12 minutes. I would like you to pick 2 of them to analyze today. Takeda-san is supervising the lesson. Just inform him I sent you to observe. Izuku's eyes brightened and Nedzu was sure that if he could feel the same emotions that humans did he would find it endearing. They immediately got up and started walking off before stopping and asking for directions to the gym where the class was being held. He gave them the vaguest directions he could reasonably expect them to understand and sent them on their way. Watching their progress through the cameras, it was amusing. They got turned around quite a few times and had to double-check their location more times than that. Still, they managed to reach the gym only 1 minute and 36 seconds late. Izuku walked into the building labeled Gym Alpha where all 40 of the third-year Hero Course students were scrambling around and lining up at training mats while Snipe, Takeda, watched the chaos carefully, calling out anyone that got too rowdy as they paired up, presumably to spar with each other. Not particularly wanting to deal with the number of people in the room, Izuku snuck their way to the hero. Instinct honed over years of dodging their classmates allowed them to pass undetected. They had also apparently evaded detection by Takeda himself, as when they tugged on his cape he practically jumped as he whirled around with a hand over his gun. Izuku quickly backed off, hands in the air. Takeda just took one look at them and sighed. "Howdy kid, what you doing here?" Nedzu-sensei wanted me to observe and analyze 2 of the students. They signed, silently noting that the few closest students had started whispering in curiosity. "Right then. I'll put you with Igarashi and Haruko. Those 2 are serious enough that they ain't likely to cause a fuss." Takeda looked over at the chaotic group of students and called out, "Thundercloud, Flora. Come up here would ya?" 2 of the students walked up to the front. The first was a tall, lean guy with a costume consisting of dark gray leggings and turtleneck with white goggles. No obvious mutations, probably an emitter quirk, likely not a physical fighter given the lack of obvious armor. Although his clothes could be padded, and the goggles are support gear, so he needs to protect his eyes, likely from his own quirk. His hero name's Thundercloud. Maybe his power has to do with the weather, or storms specifically. Single quote dot. The other was a rather muscular girl with floral patterned pants and a sleeveless green top. She also had a leaf-shaped cloak and a belt with numerous pouches. There's a lot of plant imagery in her costume, possibly a plant-related quirk. Makes sense if her hero name's Flora. If that belt has anything to do with her quirk it's probably one that requires existing material to work, but she could probably throw a good punch. She looks scary. "Hey Takeda-sensei, what's going on?" Flora asked. Takeda stepped to the side so that they could clearly see Izuku. "This is Izuku, they're gonna be observing your spar. Izuku, this is Haruko Ayame, hero named Flora, and Igarashi Hayate, hero named Thundercloud." Igarashi just nodded at them while Haruko's eyes lit up. "Hi. Are you new? Look, if any of these punks bother you just let me know alright." Izuku just nodded hesitantly. She looked fierce, not someone you wanted to end up fighting. Takeda quickly shooed both of them back to the training mats. and Izuku just took out their notebook and noted down the scramble of thoughts they had noted even before seeing both quirks in action. As both students clashed, Izuku's hand flew across the page, noting down every detail they could see. Igarashi went on the aggressive, a miniature storm levitating around him and crackles of lightning striking out at Haruko. Interesting, it looks like Igarashi's quirk can summon storms, and he seems to be able to control where the lightning it produces strikes, but it also looks like the storm itself is stuck swirling around his body. Haruko reaches into her pouch and tosses out a bunch of seeds that sprouted instantly into vines that grew around Igarashi and bound him in place, but one strike of lightning burnt the vines enough to free himself just before Haruko could land a punch. Interesting, her quirk seems to let her speed up the growth of plants. It can't be creation because she needed to throw those seeds, and I don't think it's a kinesis quirk cause she keeps throwing out new seeds every time, instead of controlling the plants to move. But it also looks like she can control exactly how they grow, plus the plants themselves appear to be enhanced. The two continued fighting, showing both their strengths and weaknesses. Haruko seemed to fall into a pattern after some time, mainly using vines to attempt to grapple her opponent, while Igarashi, despite starting the fight aggressively, was quickly thrown into a defensive position. Still, it was clear that if Haruko managed to grapple Igarashi, the match would be over. Same thing for if Igarashi ever got an opening to attack. The match continued on for a while. In fact, it was the longest spar out of the entire class until finally Haruko managed to get past Igarashi's storm barrier by growing a dense bush as a shield, allowing her to pin him to the ground. Izuku took that as an opportunity to take their leave, mostly dodging any questions from the surrounding students, almost being cornered by one student who began asking question after question, before Haruko quickly made good on her promise and pulled them away, giving Izuku a chance to escape. They made their way back to Nedzu's office. Well, this is excellent work. Although several assumptions have been made, they are all logically deduced, and mostly correct, just like your other notes. Nedzu said as he read their notes. Now tell me, if you were to fight them, what could you use to your advantage? For Igarashi, I'd find a way to stall the fight, hopefully by throwing as many obstacles as possible at him. His storm seems to be concentration-based, and the more he has to focus on dodging, the less he can use his storm as anything but a shield. As for Haruko, she's a close-range fighter. If I could attack her from a distance, I would be able to incapacitate her without much danger to myself. Good, I'll have to mention your findings to Takeda. Hopefully he can work on that. While it is often good to be focused on one area of combat, it can be detrimental if you completely ignore other skills. That seemed to be unprompted advice when the people couldn't even hear it, unless, was he giving that advice to Izuku? They got the sense that Nedzu's teachings were going to be awfully roundabout if they didn't catch on quick enough. The two of them talked some more, mainly discussing some of the other notes Izuku had made on the 2 third years, until Yamada showed up to let them know that it was time to leave. They quickly said bye to Nedzu, as well as the other teachers when they stopped by the teacher's lounge to get Aizawa. They ended up telling their mentors all about their first lesson with Nedzu on the way home. Hazashi watched in amusement as Izuku went on and on about the two students they'd had to analyze, and the code Nedzu was helping them create. He almost didn't notice his phone pinging with a single message. He checked only to realize he had several more unread messages from Tensai. Apparently Nimari had tattled, and he was wondering if he could bring his little brother over to meet Izuku on Sunday. Hazashi resolved to discuss that with Izuku later, but the newest message was from Nedzu. What do you know about Aldera Elementary? Hazashi didn't know if he'd even heard that name before, but he figured that Nedzu wouldn't ask him if he didn't suspect that Hazashi could get some answers. Still, everyone was tired after a long day. Surely all this could wait till the morning. Chapter text. Tensai wasn't sure how a child like Tenya could possibly be so stiff. Don't children normally take after the rest of their family? But one look at the Iida family would tell you that wasn't the case with Tenya. Both of their parents were pretty easygoing, and Tensai himself was always cracking jokes and, despite what his little brother would say, never quite followed the rules to a T. After all, he had become friends with Hazashi and Nimari. You didn't do that without being at least a little bit of a rule breaker. But Tenya was always the kind to emphasize the law and duty and stuff. Maybe it was because he grew up with 3 heroes always around him, and that he didn't have any friends his age except for other legacy kids like the Todoroki kids and the Yaoyorozu girl, all of whom could also be classified as far too grown up for their age. So when he'd gotten the text from Nimori about how Shota had apparently found a child while on patrol and decided to take them in, Tensai was at first surprised, then curious. He texted Hizashi. Shota never responded to texts, and asked to meet them, and if he could bring Tenya along. Not only did he want to meet this kid, but it would be nice if Tenya could make friends with a, hopefully, normal child. Hizashi had texted him back that morning saying that he was welcome to come over, so he just had to bring it up to Tenya. Everyone had sat down for dinner, and Tensai was fiddling with his chopsticks. Tenya narrowed his eyes at his big brother's behavior. It was really weird for Tensai not to have made at least one attempt at a joke throughout the dinner, however he seemed to be mumbling something under his breath. Tenya was curious, but it was most likely a particularly tough villain, or whatever mountains of paperwork he had to go through. Despite only being 24, Tensai had already taken over running the agency, and the last few months had been really tough, so he was swamped with paperwork for one thing or another all the time. But after dinner Tensai spoke up before anyone could leave the table. "Is it all right if I take Tenya with me to visit some friends tomorrow afternoon?" Tenya wasn't too familiar with Tensai's friends. They had visited before but they usually stuck to Tensai, and occasionally talked to him, but he had mostly ignored them. He didn't think there was a reason for him to be tagging along with Tensai. Apparently their parents also had the same thought. "Tensai, you know you don't really need to ask our permission for that, right?" Mama asked. "I know Mama, it's just that Zashi and Sho are apparently taking care of a kid who's Tenya's age and I thought, well, it might be good for him to meet someone he can be friends with." Tenya straightened up at the mention of that, a friend. But he didn't know how to make friends. Every kid he knew was just not interested, or they were friends in the way that they met once in a while, like whenever there was a big event, but they weren't friends in the way that Tensai described his friendship with Midnight and Present Mike, and even Eraserhead. He doubted that this new kid would want to be friends with him either, but if his brother thought it was a good idea, then he would at least give it a try. Sunday afternoon, Tensai knocked on the door of his friend's apartment. Several shuffling sounds came from inside before Hizashi opened the door. "Hey Tensai, and little Tenya too, I'd say I'm pleasantly surprised, but obviously you told me earlier." Hizashi seemed tired, maybe that was the effect children had on people. "Hey Hizashi." Tensai stepped into the apartment. The first thing he noticed was the amount of paper scattered on the desk in the living room, all essays written in English. Hizashi must have been grading assignments. Now, where was the kid? Shota had also been grading something, but now he was watching the three of them with what seemed to be amusement. That was never a good sign when it came to Shota. If he was amused it meant that there was mischief just around the corner. Hizashi seemed to catch on pretty quickly and started looking around frantically. Eventually his eyes locked onto a spot just behind Tenya. Tensai turned around only to see a small child staring at him and writing something in a notebook. It was actually kind of unnerving. The kid was just staring at him like they could see into his soul, those emerald eyes, vivisecting the very fibers of his being. Hizashi seemed to be either completely unaware of the stare or was simply ignoring it. "Izuku, this is Iida Tensai, and his little brother Tenya, they're the friends we were telling you about." "Tensai, Tenya, this is Izuku." The child just nodded, and added something else to their notebook. "Yamada, you didn't tell me your friend was Ingenium. Wait, what? How on earth did this tiny child even know that?" "That's impressive kid, how did you know that?" The kid stared at him, and Tensai was starting to feel like he had said something incredibly stupid. "You have pipes on your elbows." Okay, well now Tensai really felt like he was being stupid. How on earth had more people not made that connection before? Tenya was a bit confused. This kid, Izuku, had just been staring at his brother, and now was conversing with everyone in what Tenya assumed was sign language. He had to assume because he couldn't understand a single bit of it. There had been no reason for him to learn, despite his brother being quite fluent. But one other thing was bothering him, and that was they had only been introduced by their given name, and Tenya wasn't entirely sure what to do. They weren't friends, so it would be impolite to only refer to them by their given name, so the only logical solution was to find out what their family name was. But first, he had to know what everyone was talking about. Excuse me. But, what are you saying? He asked them. They looked at him and tilted their head, then picked up a different notebook and scribbled something in one of the pages. They handed him the notebook. One of the pages was covered in notes and diagrams about something. It was a bit hard to tell with just how much of it there was, and the other one just had, "You don't know" sign written on it. No, sorry, Tenya really did feel sorry. It wasn't fair to ask them to go out of their way and write down everything they wanted to say to him. They shrugged and wrote down, "That's fine, most people don't." Izuku noticed that the grown-ups had decided to have their own conversation a little bit away from both of them, but Izuku could see that Aizawa was paying close attention to them, just in case. They had a bunch of questions. Surely Iida had a lot of things to say about his brother, and then their notes would be even better. But, no, they couldn't be too careful, but the idea of information right in front of them had them subconsciously reaching for their analysis notebook. Then, Tenya asked an unexpected question, "What's your family name?" They had no idea why on earth that was what Tenya asked them, but they answered anyways, writing down in the spare notebook, "Midoriya." Why? "Because it would be rude of me to call you by your given name, Midoriya-san." Izuku scrunched up their nose and they could see Aizawa tilt his head towards both of them, ready to intervene if Iida did anything to make them uncomfortable. In fact, Yamada and Iida's older brother also looked over at them. "Why?" they wrote. "Because we're not friends yet, only friends call each other by their given names. Anything else is just impolite." Iida said. Well, that was true, but they didn't want to be called by their family name. Then again, what exactly meant that they weren't friends? Izuku figured that Iida was being really friendly considering that he hadn't even insulted them yet, and he was actually talking to them. Izuku thought about it, they kind of were already friends, weren't they? They wrote, "How do you become friends with someone?" Iida froze for a bit, they could see the gears in his head turning. "Well, I don't know, I think you just talk to someone, and then they agree to be friends with you." "Then do you want to be my friend?" they wrote. Iida looked thoughtful for a bit. "Okay, I guess this means I can call you Izuku, and you can call me Tenya. This is exciting, I've never had a real friend before." "Neither have I, but now we both have a friend," Izuku wrote. "Yay, but now we have to tell each other about ourselves. That's what I've seen friends do in the movies and stuff," Tenya asked. "Okay, how about we take turns asking each other questions?" Izuku wrote. "I'll go first. Who's your favorite hero?" "Obviously it's Ingenium. My big brother is the best there is." Tensai watched the interaction with growing confusion and amusement. Leave it to his friends to find a child just as odd as them. Somehow both kids had become fast friends by entirely ignoring the normal way in which people made friends, and honestly, Tensai was beginning to think that this way was much more efficient. He could hear Hisashi laughing behind him. "I can't believe it, I'm going to be honest, I expected that little Tenya's bluntness would have made things difficult, but it looks like both of them are actually getting along." After a while Tensai had to drag Tenya away from his new friend so that they could go home. But on the way Tenya wouldn't stop talking about how smart Izuku was. Apparently those notebooks were filled with hero analyses, and they had one on Ingenium. Of course that's all that Tenya would talk about until they got home. And after dinner he immediately retreated into his room, which was unusual, but soon after he approached Tensai and asked if he could use his computer. "What for?" "I want to learn JSL so that I can talk to Izuku." "Oh, that was adorable. Sure, I can teach you some too." "Yes please." Tenya sounded so excited, so they studied different signs until it was time for Tenya's bedtime. Tensai was sure that letting Tenya meet Izuku was one of the best decisions he'd ever made. Hisashi hadn't really paid any mind to the text Nedzu had sent him that Friday. He knew it was probably important, but there were other things he had to be worried about, like the fact that Izuku was having nightmares every single day. He and Shota wanted to ask Inui for advice, but they hadn't had the chance to bring it up to him. Since it was the last week of the school year, classes were getting a lot more chaotic as students got excited. It was particularly bad for the third years who were getting ready for graduation. All the teachers had been scrambling around simply trying to keep the students in line during class, not that they were any better. The teachers' lounge was abuzz with activity, although everyone was thankfully toning things down from last year. All of the new teachers had finally gotten settled in since last year. Besides, Izuku was also in the teachers' lounge whenever they weren't in Nedzu's office, so everyone had to keep things relatively calm for their sake. Not that anyone minded. They'd all gotten attached to the kid rather quickly, even though no one other than Shota and Hizashi knew much about them. At some point even Tanaka had left their spot at the cafeteria, which was an incredibly rare occurrence, simply to say hello to Izuku. All things considered, it wasn't until Wednesday when he finally found out what that text was about. It was a routine staff meeting. Hizashi hadn't thought much about it. When he got to the meeting room, Nedzu was seated at the head of the table, shuffling through some papers. He thought that was a bit odd, especially considering these meetings were usually just for everyone to talk about any issues they'd noticed with the students, like bullying or other troubling behavior, as well as organize future tests and exams. Majima was already there as well as Takeda. He seemed to be purposefully ignoring whatever the principal was planning. Hizashi looked over at Majima questioningly, but Z just shook her head in shared confusion. The rest of the staff slowly filed in, and seemed just as confused as everyone else. Finally, once everyone had taken their seats, Nedzu started the meeting, and it was just a normal meeting. What was he doing with those papers then? Why did some of those look like incident report files? What was going on? Was nobody going to mention the very clearly visible school files that looked nothing like the ones for Ua? Hizashi could see almost everyone's eyes occasionally glance to the files. They were all curious, but then again, nobody dared to speak up if Nedzu wasn't going to bring them up. After the usual discussions had ended, Nedzu went right back to going through the files, and Anon decided to take one for the team and ask what had been on everyone's mind, because during the meeting Nedzu had been distracted. And whatever could actually take that much of his attention was something that everyone should probably be concerned about. Sir, what exactly are those files? They asked. Hesitantly, everyone's eyes turned to Nedzu and he just tilted his head at Hizashi and Shota. I believe you two will have a clearer answer than I currently do. That was a particular surprise, since they had no idea what was going on. Shota shook his head. What are you talking about? These are files on a certain school, Aldera Elementary, the school that Midoriya Izuku apparently attends. Oh, Hizashi now completely understood why the principal had been so utterly distracted. Shota had sat up straight at the mention of Izuku's name. They both knew what that meant. This was the school whose teachers allowed children to get beaten up almost every day, and allowed one to almost be killed, just because they didn't have the strongest quirk, or in Izuku's case, no quirk at all. Apparently, their reaction was enough to warrant concern from everyone in the room. Nimori was the first person to speak up. Okay, I'm gonna guess that the school isn't the best, considering both of your reactions. What? She shook her head in amusement. Sweetie, you look like you're trying to glare a hole into the table. Takeda huffed. I reckon it's bad enough to warrant an investigation and shut down if Nedzu's bein' all fussy about it, she said, still not looking up from her own work. He'd been teaching at Ua the longest out of any of them, so he had a pretty good knowledge of Nedzu's behavior. The rest of them usually trusted whatever he said about the principal. Nedzu had indeed investigated Izuku's place of education, and he could barely find anything on the school. Not for lack of trying, mind you. It appeared that, for whatever reason, the school simply did not keep any records. That would have been concerning enough, even if the files they did keep weren't lackluster at best, and downright falsified at worst. How did Nedzu know they were falsified? He didn't. Not for all of them. However, there was one file he knew must have been full of lies. The student record for Midoriya Izuku. There were far too many marks on their record to make sense, and the reasons listed for disciplinary action was almost always that they were disruptive and constantly starting fights with the other students, a statement that fell apart the second you met them. Nedzu had observed his new student over the few days that he'd worked with them. They were the least confrontational person one could ever meet. They avoided other people like the plague and wouldn't cause a commotion if their life depended on it. Most of the reports were altercations between Izuku and another student named Bakugo Katsuki, a student whose file painted him as the perfect child, perfect grades, perfect behavior, perfect quirk. That was what caught Nedzu's eye. Looking back at Izuku's file, he found various notes from their teachers about how their aggression was likely jealousy because the other children had quirks. Looking further into the student records, he found a pattern that angered him the more he looked at it. Without fail, all the children who had what would be considered weak or villainous quirks had long histories of disciplinary action with condescending comments about them being horrible children, while the students who had traditionally strong quirks had perfect records and were praised to the high heavens. Statistically, that wasn't a possible outcome. The only logical explanation then was that the reports were incorrect, a result of biased teachers and a careless or malicious principal. Discrimination was something of a sore topic for Nedzu. What with his past, to think that an entire school of children were being hurt in this way, for not only was the school basically destroying the futures of the students they discriminated against, but they were also doing a major disservice to the students who weren't being guided properly because the teachers refused to correct any bad behavior. He hadn't intended to bring up the issue during this meeting. In fact, he had planned to call a meeting at the last day of school to discuss the options. However, he had gotten distracted. Everyone had noticed that he had a new project, and while he could have simply ignored them, knowing that they wouldn't speak up against him if he shut them down quickly, it did present an interesting opportunity to close a minor hole in his plan. As predicted, Aizawa and Yamada had reacted immediately. Even the people who weren't paying attention, namely Kato and Takeda, had quickly grown concerned due to the sheer rage that radiated off the both of them. Nedzu found it quite interesting how protective they were over Izuku, considering they claimed that they had found the child only last week. He suspected there was much more to that story than any of them had shared. However, he somewhat understood that they wouldn't take kindly to him trying to get that information out of them, so he waited. The truth would reveal itself in due time. Of course, Takeda was the first person to recognize his intentions. She had hit the nail on the head, so to speak, although, depending on whatever Aizawa and Yamada could tell them, a few arrests might have to be added to the list. I had been investigating because I found it hard to believe that Izuku had not been further ahead in their education thanks to their intelligence. However, I appear to have found an entirely different issue. It appears that the school has been letting quirkism run rampant in its halls. From looking through the records, it appears that any children with undesirable quirks are being given marks on their records for even minor infractions, while children with so-called perfect quirks have nothing but perfect records. Suddenly the entire meeting room erupted into conversation, but Yamada and Aizawa looked minorly confused. Nedzu wasn't quite sure why. They had to have been expecting this given their reactions earlier. "That's all?" Yamada asked. "Are you sure that's everything you could find?" "Unfortunately, the school doesn't keep very many records, only the student files and expenses. Everything else must be being handled under the table. Even the camera records are full of gaps where they clearly deleted footage." "Why? Is there something else we should know about?" "It's not just bias in the records. The staff at the school actively encourage bullying and fighting, at least, from what Izuku has told us. That got reactions out of everyone, mainly anger. It was a lot of yelling until Inui finally managed to get everyone to shut up by barking as loudly as possible. Look," he said, "this is all awful and that school should be getting shut down, but don't you think we should at least ask Izuku about it? They should be able to tell us everything, if they're comfortable with that, of course." It took a bit to convince everyone that bringing Izuku into the discussion wouldn't be a terrible idea, but eventually Aizawa left to go get them from the teacher's lounge. By the time he returned with Izuku, the discussion had somewhat calmed down. Everyone tried not to put too much attention on Izuku. They had all quickly learned that they started to panic if too many eyes were on them at once. They sat down in a spare chair that had been put next to Aizawa's. They looked directly at Nedzu. "What do you want to know?" "First of all, I assume Aizawa-san filled you in on what we are discussing." Izuku nodded. "You want to investigate my school on the basis of quirk discrimination, right?" "That about sums it up. I have found evidence that they are disciplining students differently depending on their quirks. However, Yamada and Aizawa have mentioned that there is more I should be aware of." Izuku nodded. They started slowly signing, like they weren't sure what to say. "The teachers, I'm pretty sure they mess with kids' grades if they think they're higher or lower than what the kid deserves, and they accuse us of cheating if we get any marks too high. You get a mark on your record if they think you're disturbing the class. For any reason. One time I saw a kid just tapping her desk and she got detention for it. I think they just didn't like her because she had a villainous quirk. And they don't care if you get told to kill yourself. Actually, they might tell you themselves. There was an uproar at that. Interesting. I believe Yamada-san also mentioned that physical violence was encouraged. Don't you already know that from the camera footage? Unfortunately there are conspicuous gaps in the recordings. I suspect they purposefully delete the footage that shows any and all bullying. That makes sense. Anyway, the kids with stronger quirks are encouraged to put other kids in their place, and it doesn't matter if a teacher is watching or not, cause they'll just ignore you, and you can't go to the nurse's office either cause she might refuse to help you and then you get in trouble for wasting her time. Nedzu saw Shuzenji visibly bristle at that. That is illegal. Nurses can't just refuse to treat someone like that. It's grounds for getting her license revoked. I'm sure we can add that to the list of evidence. I am curious though, what is the worst incident you can remember? Nedzu knew that whatever he needed to launch that investigation would have to come from that. Izuku paused for a second, genuinely trying to remember. They shook their head. Maybe that time one of the upperclassmen broke a kid's arms and then they had to get through the entire day like that. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff that might count. Yamada looked at them incredulously. What do you mean you don't know? What about what happened to you? I'd say that's probably the worst thing that school let happen. But no one's going to take that seriously. I'm Quirkless. Nedzu cleared his throat. I assure you I can make them care. What happened? Izuku looked doubtful of Nedzu's claim, but explained nonetheless. Well, that one time, I think I almost got killed by my classmates. And the teachers might have encouraged them. You could have heard a pin drop in that room after that revelation. Khan hesitantly spoke up. What do you mean, almost? How did you survive? It asked. Izuku was silent for a bit. I managed to get away from them. I collapsed behind a dumpster. That's when Aizawa and Yamada saved me. Well, that wasn't exactly how Nedzu expected to find out why the two of them had been so vague about how Izuku had ended up in their care. I think Shuzenji-san could tell you all the injuries I had. Nedzu noted that Shuzenji's eyes widened a bit. You mean that all those injuries were caused by your classmates? She asked incredulously. Izuku nodded. Kid, the only reason you lived is thanks to my quirk working instantly. If you had taken any longer to be healed even that little bit, you would have died that night. Even Yamada and Aizawa seemed shocked by this. Had they not realized how dire Izuku's situation had been? Everyone was silent for a long while. Nedzu simply nodded. Right, well that is certainly enough of an incident to warrant launching an investigation. That simple response opened the metaphorical floodgates. Everyone was talking over each other now. Most were calling for an immediate shutdown of the school. Nedzu was sure he even heard someone, probably Majima, suggest arson. Quiet, he said calmly. Instantly the silence returned to the room. I can guarantee, I will not let this school or its staff get away with light punishment. They certainly will suffer. However, I need time to build up the case. Because there are no camera records, I will have to monitor the cameras myself and catch any instance of improper conduct before they delete it. Luckily, if it occurs as frequently as Izuku claims, then I should have a proper case against them by the week's end, which also means I will have it shut down before the next school year starts, meaning no students will be displaced during the school year. Everyone seemed satisfied by that answer, but there was still one thing Nedzu needed to cover, that minor hole in his plan. However, there is a minor issue. While I'm sure most of the students would be able to find schools that won't discriminate against them, Izuku is still quirkless. Anywhere they go they will likely be harshly bullied and wouldn't get the education they require. That is the one detail I have not figured out yet. Izuku knew that Nedzu was right. There was no way they'd ever be treated fairly by any school they tried to attend. They were about to say that it was fine, when Ishiyama spoke up. I don't know what you do about other subjects, but I'd be happy to teach them literature. Izuku was shocked. Sure, they had become somewhat friendly with the UA staff, but they never expected that one of them would offer to teach them. And soon it wasn't just one, as all the other teachers chorused their agreement. Izuku could feel their eyes watering a bit as they heard everyone speak. Nedzu turned to them. Well, it seems that we have a solution to your education predicament right here. Do you agree? Izuku nodded gratefully, still unable to comprehend what had just happened. Then it's settled. I shall let all of you know when the formal investigation commences. Izuku realized in that moment that their little bubble of safety had just expanded by 9, and they couldn't be happier. Chapter text. Nedzu watched the screen, beady eyes flitting around, watching files be cleaned, camera footage be erased, any trace of educational negligence wiped clean from the records. All the while a small handful of people scrambled to clean hallways and classrooms, scrubbing away dried blood, hiding burn marks, moving around damaged lockers, getting rid of heavily damaged tables and chairs, all to appear, for a single day, as an upstanding place of education. But Aldera Elementary was a corrupt school, and no matter how much they tried to hide it, he would know, and he would tear them down, brick by blood-stained brick. It had been only a month since he began his investigation, and normally that shouldn't have been nearly enough time to build up a case against the school staff. However, he had spent almost all his free time watching the cameras of Aldera for any sign of illegal activity. Some might call his methods extreme, however nobody would argue that he didn't get results. Besides, it was almost too easy to find what he was looking for. It was a miracle the school hadn't been investigated before. Now the next step of Nedzu's plan commenced. He had contacted some acquaintances who could get the school shut down from an educational standpoint, and he might have let it rest there, had it not been for the fact that some of the things the staff had done were outright criminal, and they practiced quirk discrimination. If there was one thing Nedzu couldn't stand, it was quirk discrimination. He had made a call to Tsukauchi, the one person he could fully trust to not throw out the whole case just because the children being hurt didn't have traditionally good quirks. So as it currently stood, the new school year was just a day away, and the school was under heavy review, and was likely to either be shut down or entirely restaffed, while any staff who could be arrested were being quietly rounded up by Tsukauchi and the police. The Board of Education had, of course, informed all the students' families that Aldera Elementary might not be open for this year. Hopefully it was enough time for those parents to find new schools for their children. The door to the office creaked open and Izuku walked in. They sat down in a chair next to his, eyes glued to the monitor, even though it was already past the end of the school year and nobody should have been inside the school grounds. Nedzu had made an exception for Izuku. Despite their previous concerns about the investigation, they had been insistent on at least being able to witness the results. And today was the day that they truly made their move, one last step, one meeting that would seal the fate of this wretched place. A meeting with the principal of Aldera Elementary as well as a select few members of staff. The one conducting the meeting was one of his contacts in the local Board of Education. As much as Nedzu would have loved to go down there himself and put the fear of God in that crooked man, he would have attracted far too much attention. Given that his name and position as a hero held quite a bit of power, people's attention would be drawn if they found out that a pro-hero was part of an investigation into a school. In fact, that was why the only hero that was going to be at the meeting was Aizawa. He was unknown enough as an underground hero that his presence wouldn't ring any alarm bells. He was going both in case something went awry, as well as the simple reason that Aizawa is an incredibly stubborn man, and he refused to be kept out of this particular part of the plan. Nedzu suspected he just wanted to be able to torment the staff who had made life so tortuous for Izuku. Izuku had mixed feelings about the whole operation. Sure, this school had made their life hell, and certainly deserved to be shut down, but they couldn't help but feel like they were doing something wrong. Like they shouldn't be happy that the school was getting shut down, especially considering that it was their fault. None of this would have happened if they hadn't told their mentors about what the school was doing. They could imagine their old teachers' reactions, yelling at them, telling them that they should have just kept their mouths shut. After all, the school was doing so much good for most of its students. What did it matter if a few suffered? But they had spent years interrupting fights and shielding the other kids whenever they could. They saw exactly how many people were being hurt by the might makes right mentality that the teachers practically drilled into your head. And Nedzu had explained to them that even the kids who seemed to be on top were going to suffer horribly later in life if they were allowed to continue down this path. Still, as they watched the camera feed with great anticipation, some part of them, buried deep in their mind, long forgotten and crushed under the weight of the expectation for them to be meek and forgiving to all who caused them pain, felt joy, a sick sense of joy at watching the people who had wronged them so horribly get exactly what they deserved. Perhaps it was wrong for them to feel that way. Even so, they were looking forward to seeing their old principal's face as he would try to worm his way out, only to be presented with all the recordings that Nezu had spent so long patiently obtaining. Their eyes snapped to the entrance camera feed as two people entered the building. One was Aizawa and the other was a friend of Nezu's. Even from through the screen they could tell that both of them were tense. Time to see how well this meeting would go. Shota's gaze flitted around the hallways as they walked into Aldera Elementary. Beside him Nezu's contact, a person with a quirk that gave her dove wings named Shiratori, silently tutted to herself as she examined the building with mild disdain, their feathers ruffled as they noted down all the poorly hidden damage. Shota would bet that most of it came from students using their untrained quirks and accidentally hitting walls and doors, although he noted that a few lockers seemed to have much more damage than the rest or were oddly missing. He could guess who those lockers belonged to. He could have even sworn he saw a bloodstain on one of the floorboards, and knowing what happened here, that was probably a reasonable assumption. The principal's office seemed to be completely pristine. As expected, the principal himself was a plain-looking man, the kind of plain that even if you met him 100 times you still wouldn't recognize him in a crowd. Shota wondered if that was his quirk, or if he was just that boring. There were 3 other teachers in the room as well. Everyone looked relaxed, smug even. He could have sworn he saw 2 of the teachers silently laughing and talking amongst themselves. Only the principal seemed nervous, likely because he was the one who knew exactly how much scrutiny the school was being put under. Of course, not even the principal had any reason to suspect anything too unusual, since as far as they were concerned they were just meeting with an official from the Board of Education. Shota was here under the pretense of being Shiratori's assistant, a little white lie just to ensure that nobody would be on high alert during the meeting. The more relaxed they were, the more likely they were going to slip up. Shiratori sat across from the principal while Shota remained standing, purposefully putting himself right next to the door to prevent anyone from leaving. Was he being paranoid? Maybe, but he wasn't taking any chances with this meeting. They had to seal the deal now, or the whole investigation would be delayed a full year. Luckily they had what they needed, thanks to Nezu. The laptop in Shota's bag contained all of the recordings they'd need to shut down the whole school. Shiratori began the discussion with some idle small talk that Shota couldn't be bothered to listen to. He knew what she was doing. She was making herself seem approachable, letting the principal drop his guard. After all, they were a friend of Nezu's. Of course they knew how to manipulate their way into people's hearts and get them to spill their deepest secrets. Shota tuned back in once they finally got to the topic at hand, signaled by Shiratori subtly turning on a small audio recorder that was attached to her sleeve. Well, Shiratori-san, I can tell you right now that our school does its best to care for each and every one of our students, the principal said with a sickeningly sweet grin. Shota had to bite his tongue. There would be time to tear them apart later. For now they needed to get him to dig his own grave. I'm sure you do. However, I would like to ask a few questions regarding the way you run this school. Could you give me an overview of the disciplinary systems in place here? Right. They both knew exactly how the school disciplined their students, which is to say, not at all, not when they really needed disciplining at least. Shiratori had been given a copy of the camera footage to go through, just so that they knew what to ask about. Well, we do what any other school does. If a student is out of line we give them detention, or call their parents. Lies. Nezu had checked. There had been no phone calls made during the days that he had observed the school. And if the behavior continues we are forced to suspend the student or even expel them. Of course what he didn't mention was the fact that suspensions were only ever given to students with undesirable quirks. Of course, but what kinds of things would you consider out of line? Fishing for answers. If Shiratori didn't give a suggestion, then the principal would have to answer from his own morals, and he'd probably slip up and forget to mention something. Disturbing the class, cheating on tests, you know, normal things. Really, I find it odd that you didn't mention bullying in that list. You do discourage bullying, right? Yes, of course. We don't tolerate the harassment of students. So if a member of staff saw a child being hurt they would step in immediately. Shota could see the principal's face drop for a split second. He was starting to suspect. Unfortunately for him, it was far too late to back down. Shota flashed a grin at him. His deranged grin that struck fear into the hearts of anyone who saw it, it was quite effective at unnerving criminals and students alike. The principal's face paled, as did the rest of the teachers, who were slowly backing away from where Shota was standing. Maybe he was enjoying their fear a little too much, but honestly, who could blame him? Criminals like them needed a bit of fear in their hearts. Besides, it was always fun to see just how long it took for people to crack. Then again, he figured he should stop. For now, Shiratori still had to get the information she needed, and that wouldn't be possible if everyone was too unnerved to speak. Well, yes, we would step in. The principal's voice had gotten much higher, it almost sounded squeaky. Oh, then if we looked through the camera footage, we wouldn't find any instance of a teacher watching a child get bullied. And certainly no instance of a teacher encouraging it. The principal seemed to become much more confident for that question, no doubt assuming that they would go through the footage that already existed, which would exclude the deleted footage. Unfortunately for him, this confidence was far too misplaced. Of course, we can pull up the footage now if you like. Maki-san, if you would kindly. That won't be necessary. Shiratori cut him off. My assistant and I have already gathered some footage. We can just watch that. After all, it would save everyone the hassle, wouldn't it? They smiled sweetly, but her wings were puffed up threateningly. Shota pulled the laptop from the bag he'd brought, and set it on the table, opening it to show a video of the camera feeds. Playing it revealed a compilation of instances in which a teacher or other member of staff watched and/or encouraged bullying and fighting. I think it's clear that you've done nothing but lie to us, isn't it? Shiratori asked the principal, smiling all the while. The principal quivered in his seat, too afraid to say anything to the contrary. One of the teachers, Maki, was apparently too stupid to take the hint. You can't call that bullying, those students are simply defending themselves from those evil children. She said, in reference to a kid with a villainous quirk being attacked by 3 other students. That was it. Shota was done with this whole situation. Screw staying quiet, he was going to give this lady a piece of his mind. Really? Because from what I see, it's 3 kids beating up their classmate while a teacher encourages them. Truly, you think a child as young as that even has the capacity to be evil? What are they? 7 years old. It's people like you who are the real villains. Just a shame that you are too up your own ass to see it. You stupid, good-for-nothing, stains on humanity. Shota didn't raise his voice once. They weren't worth the effort of yelling, instead used an icier tone of voice that certainly caused all of the teachers to cower even further into the corner. Even the principal looked like he had just been slapped. Shiratori smiled and continued speaking, sealing the fate of Aldera Elementary. This meeting was only a formality. This school will be getting shut down. There was no question about that from the beginning. This was just to warn all of you to get your affairs in order, as I don't think any of you will be teaching anyone after this. The 2 of them promptly left the building. Shiratori left to finish the paperwork needed to get everything done, while Shota was met at the gates by Hazashi, who immediately asked for details. Shota just laughed and said to wait until they got home. Izuku had slowly felt their eyes start to water as they watched the footage. Nedzu had been mildly concerned, but they assured him they were crying happy tears. That wasn't really true. Honestly, they were more relieved than happy. Even after knowing Aizawa for months now, they were still surprised when he snapped at Maki-sensei. When their guardians came to pick them up, they hugged Aizawa tightly. They left for home only after Yamada made Nedzu promise to give him a copy of that footage. Well, how'd it go? Yamada asked once they got home. Well enough. You should have seen the principal's face when he realized just how screwed he was. Izuku felt their eyes start to water again, thinking of how much their mentors had done for them over the months they'd known them. Little listener, are you okay? Izuku just hugged both of their mentors and cried. Izuku. Aizawa sounded concerned. What's wrong? Izuku shook their head. Happy tears. And this time they really were. For the first time in 5 long years, they cried for joy. Chapter text. The new school year meant that UA's halls would be filled with chatter as new students entered the building for the first time. But even before the students arrived, there was a certain level of energy that permeated the air. Most of the teachers were prepared for dealing with the new first years. Nedzu was making sure everything was set up for orientation. Shuzenji was preparing the infirmary for the inevitable influx of idiotic students injuring themselves or each other, and Izuku somehow got caught up in it all. They found themselves scrambling around the teacher's lounge, avoiding the adults running around and getting papers organized. It was the first time they'd seen the other teachers since that staff meeting last month. In the meantime, they'd been spending most of their time at the apartment, or sometimes at the nearby park with their guardians. Seeing as they didn't have much to do, and no friends, other than Tenya who had visited a few times, don't get them wrong, Tenya was a really good friend, but he was only one person after all. They had gotten to UA early with their guardians, their bright yellow backpack. They had refused to allow Yamada to buy them a new one. No matter how much he asked, now filled not just with their notebooks but also with some textbooks, Yamada had gotten them so that Izuku could restart their schooling as soon as possible. It was a simple plan really. Izuku would spend the majority of their time in the teacher's lounge studying, with help from whatever teachers were free at the moment. Fridays would be their analysis lessons with Nedzu. Izuku had also asked Aizawa about their physical training. They hadn't kept up with their training since the incident and, other than that one time, they hadn't gone out as their vigilante persona either. He had tried to argue the point, and it took a few days of pestering, but he eventually conceded that they could join him for patrols occasionally as long as they didn't actually fight anyone. Izuku had barely contained their excitement during that conversation. They had seen plenty of their new neighborhood in the daytime, but they hadn't really had a chance to see it at night. Was there a high chance of Nedzu probably making the connection between them and the vigilante following Eraserhead around? Definitely. Izuku suspected that it would take about a month if they were being generous, but was that really going to stop them? Not a chance. For now they had somehow made their way to the corner of the room without getting tangled in whatever the heck everyone else was doing, even if the amount of talking was making it rather difficult to tell where everyone was at any given time, and everyone was moving about sporadically, and they were fairly certain someone threw a stapler across the room at some point. To be fair, these were all pro-heroes. They were likely being careful not to let Izuku get hurt, but honestly from the outside the teacher's lounge probably looked like a whirlwind of chaos. Although from their spot in the corner, Izuku could appreciate the surprising efficiency of the situation. Their spot consisted of a small desk and chair that had been dragged out of storage. They could have used the couch, but they appreciated having their own designated area. They hadn't really gotten a good look at the organized chaos earlier. But at the moment, they could see Majima looking over their students' work while also acting as a translator for Takeda, who seemed to have begun speaking almost exclusively in cowboy slang while glaring at some papers. Meanwhile Kayama, Yamada and Kadu were done with their work and started talking with each other and writing down what looked like bets on a whiteboard, and Aizawa and Kan were comparing student files and discussing the listed quirks, or maybe they were arguing. Honestly they couldn't tell. Kuros was sitting at their desk and throwing paper airplanes at anyone that moved. Ishiyama and Inui seemed to be staying out of the chaos for the most part. But Izuku could see them quietly start setting up a whiteboard that had each teacher's name with a set of tally marks next to it. The top of the board read, "Chaos caused this year." How any of the teachers had caused incidents on the first day was beyond Izuku, but the teachers with tallies next to their names were Aizawa and Kan with one each, probably one of their petty arguments, Takeda with 2, likely for the sheer amount of incomprehensible slang he was using, and Kuros with 1, probably for the paper airplanes. However, things soon calmed down once Nedzu dropped from the vents to remind everyone that orientation was beginning soon. It was almost unnerving, the hush that settled over the room as everyone filed out of the room. Izuku took it as an opportunity to start on their studies without all the chaos to distract them. While they found it fascinating how everyone seemed to be able to function even with everything going on, it was certainly something they would have to get used to. Most of the day went by rather smoothly. Izuku would be studying, and whichever teacher was in the room would help with whatever subject they could in between doing their own work. In fact, Izuku found themselves rather enjoying their studies, which was unusual even for them, or, perhaps it wasn't that unusual. They had always loved to learn new things, and really when they thought about it, they were only miserable at school because of the teachers and the other students. At least their new teachers were nice, and, whenever they talked to them, Izuku even got to learn some things about them, like how Kadu lost his legs to a villain when he was first starting out as a hero. or that Kuros's mother was an astronaut and their costume was a tribute to her. Some things were smaller details of course, like Ishiyama liking sweets, Kayama having a collection of stuffed animals, and Takeda doing wood carving as a hobby. Their notebook was off to the side, slowly being filled with little facts about the heroes. Of course, all of the additions were written entirely in code. They had been practicing over the month and they had already gotten the hang of writing in it. They couldn't do it as effortlessly as normal however, which caused a bit of a predicament when their thoughts went by faster than they could write them. Their current solution was writing down their immediate thoughts in Japanese, and then translating them later. Of course they would destroy the copy in Japanese afterwards. They had begun translating their existing entries into the code as well, beginning with the entries on their teachers. Nedzu observed his student from the vents. Izuku truly was a fascinating human. They had gone through what should have been an entire week's worth of subject matter in a single day. It seemed that when they had the opportunity to indulge in their studies without hindrance they were quite the fast learner. Of course, Nedzu didn't intend to let them get by just reading textbooks, but it appeared that he would have to adjust the contents of the surprise tests he had been preparing. It had been quite a while since he had gotten personally involved in a student's development, 7 years to be precise, although he might argue that even Aizawa hadn't caught his attention quite like this. Yes, if Izuku continued at this pace Nedzu fully expected that they would move on to a middle school curriculum within the year. It appeared that the rest of his staff had also gotten incredibly attached to Izuku. That was obvious enough when they had all agreed to assist in their education. However, it was interesting to catch snippets of conversation as he scampered around in the vents throughout the school. Every time he passed by the teacher's lounge he heard at least one of the teachers sharing knowledge and stories with Izuku. Of course he would have to remind them that any information about himself and his methods was not to be shared. He had a reputation to maintain after all. He couldn't be an omniscient creature without a little trickery after all, and if one of those methods was hiding in the vents to eavesdrop on people, well, only he and his staff would know. Maybe someday he would teach his ways to Izuku. He suspected that they would make a terrifying hero if they had the right knowledge. They were keen, and already knew how to disappear in a crowd. If they wished, criminals would fear them like they feared him. If only they shed that meek attitude. It was so clearly only surface level, but perhaps even they hadn't realized that yet. Chapter text. Izuku pulled the mask over their face, checking that they had everything they needed once more before climbing out of their window and onto the fire escape. From there it was easy to parkour onto the roof where Aizawa was waiting. Finally, their first patrol in a month and a half. It had been far too long in their opinion and they were eager to stretch their legs. Maybe this didn't quite count as a patrol, since they wouldn't actually be fighting anyone. Aizawa had refused to let them on account of them being unarmed. The sign pole they'd been using previously had been lost when they moved out of the warehouse, and while they did have a pocket knife on them for emergencies, they were far from skilled with bladed weapons. Another concern had been for their sleep schedule, but honestly it wasn't like they got any sleep normally, and besides there was always the option of coffee. They paused in their tracks at that thought. Maybe Yamada was right. They really were taking too much influence from Aizawa. Oh well. They took one last jump and landed right next to Aizawa, who barely acknowledged their presence before he took off across the rooftops. Izuku quickly followed, easily keeping pace with him as the pair crossed the city. Oh how they missed this feeling. The cold of the night, the air rushing past them, the silence and darkness perfect for going unnoticed, the feel of their feet hitting the concrete of the rooftops. It was comforting in an odd sense. Despite not being quite the same, it was still familiar. Running across concrete roofs, jumping from fire escapes, landing on dumpsters, they darted along with practiced ease. Eraser was always one step ahead of them, following a path long etched into his mind. While Izuku's movements were far more chaotic as they had always been, it was easy, comfortable even, for the two of them to slip back into their old dynamic, not mentor and student, or guardian and child, but rather hero and vigilante, Eraserhead and Wraith. They always felt much more confident as Wraith than they ever did as Izuku, so patrol mostly consisted of them sassing and poking fun at Eraser. Izuku noted, somewhere in their mind, that they'd never actually gotten to appreciate just how much of a skilled fighter Eraser was. Usually they were either fighting with him or sparring against him, so watching him take effortlessly down a pair of muggers was just a bit mesmerizing. They sat on the rooftop, staring down at the fight, if it could even be called that. Eraser had the first mugger tied up in his capture scarf before either of them could even blink, and the other was knocked out just as swiftly. The person they were trying to mug had already called the police and ran away. Eraser climbed back onto the rooftop after securing both muggers. Izuku couldn't wait until the day when they could take down criminals like that. When they became a hero, they were gonna be just like Eraser, taking down the bad guys before they can even react. Their mind went full nerd mode as they analyzed the fight in their head, mostly because even though they had practically memorized Eraser's fighting style by now, there was one thing they still had yet to figure out: how did he control his capture weapon? They had asked before, probably one of the first questions they'd asked him when they began training. He had assured them that there was no technology involved, nor a quirk effect, and that the scarf was made from steel alloy and carbon fiber, not regular cloth. Izuku suspected that it was a series of hand movements that allowed the scarf to move like it did, but they were likely incredibly minute, as it was almost never obvious, even when Izuku had spent an entire sparring session focusing just on Aizawa's hands to see if they could spot it. They wondered how long it took him to master the weapon, probably at least a year. Patrol went smoothly for a little while, but soon enough something went awry. At this point Izuku figured they just had terrible luck. They had been standing on a rooftop overlooking an alleyway as Eraser battled a group of drug dealers. That kind of thing was getting far too common for some reason, and one of them tried to escape by climbing the fire escape, right onto the roof where they were. With Eraser occupied with the rest of the group, there was nobody to stop the dealer as she immediately charged at Izuku. She must have had a transformer quirk, because one second they were facing a petite-looking woman and the next they were facing what looked like a werewolf. Izuku dodged the charge easily, however that didn't stop the lady from trying to run away, leaving them with only one option. They knew they shouldn't do this. Eraser had specifically forbidden them from fighting anybody, but if they didn't, the criminal was gonna get away, and surely stopping that was worth the risk. They made that decision in the split second they needed to dodge a claw swipe, and they quickly took the pocket knife out of their pocket, and slashed out, barely grazing the criminal's arm. She turned around and once again tried to swipe at them. Her reflexes were fast, really fast, probably thanks to her quirk. They almost got hit several times before an opportunity presented itself, and they managed to hit her on the head with the knife's handle, swinging with all their might, which wasn't really that much. They could have just stabbed her. It certainly would have been more efficient, but that would have been unnecessary, and it was way more brutal than they were willing to go. Instead, the hit stunned her for a few seconds, and all that stalling was plenty of time for Eraser to show up and restrain her with his scarf. Shota quickly knocked out the criminal before turning to Wraith. He had to make sure they weren't hurt. He double and triple checked that they in fact weren't injured. After all, they were always good at hiding their injuries, but they were fine, which was a relief. But on the other hand, Wraith, what on earth were you thinking? As relived as he was that they weren't hurt, he was also incredibly annoyed at the reckless stunt they'd pulled. Didn't I specifically tell you not to fight anybody if you could avoid it? Well, she would have gotten away. And it wouldn't be right if I just stood by and let her run. But you could have gotten seriously hurt. Especially since you only have that pocket knife to defend yourself. Isn't that okay? It doesn't matter as long as a hero gets the villain. Right, and it really doesn't matter if I get hurt. I can deal with a lot of pain after all. Shota stared at Wraith in disbelief. Were they really trying to argue this point? He thought they'd gotten past that. How many times had he explained that just because they could tolerate getting hurt, didn't mean they should? Kid, seriously, listen to me. Capturing a criminal, especially one this petty, is not worth your life or any major injury for that matter. Shota started pacing, fully intending to sternly lecture Wraith about putting their life in danger for no reason. But it's a hero's job to catch criminals, and they put themselves at risk all the time to do it. Shota stopped and looked at Izuku. He sighed. Typical, the kid had no sense of self-preservation anyways. As long as they thought they were doing something to help people, they never cared what happened to them. He knelt down in front of them, putting a hand on their shoulder and looking them dead in the eye. You're right, it's a hero's job to catch criminals, and it's a hero's job to risk getting hurt. But you're not a hero. Not yet. Right now you're still a kid, and it's not your job to put yourself in harm's way just to stop a crime, understood? Izuku nodded after a few seconds, which was far too much hesitation in Shota's opinion. but at least he knew that they wouldn't try that again. He stood back up and looked over at the lady who was slumped over, unconscious. He ended up dragging her back into the alleyway. This was one of the situations that he would wait for the cops, probably accompanied by Detective Tsukauchi. That man handled far more cases that he was paid to. And the police had been especially concerned about the increase in criminal activity, particularly drug deals. Shota figured that it was probably just a wave of people getting desperate and turning to less than legal means to find money. There had been some major villain attacks in the area, and that usually caused quite a bit of financial trouble for any people who get caught in the crossfire. Soon enough the sirens of police cars filled the night air. Shota turned to Wraith, expecting them to run away, but they were just standing there. They pulled their mask down for a second and gave him a wild grin. Oh, they wanted to cause trouble. Shota gave them an equally wild grin in return. If they were going to make some mischief, well, he wasn't going to stop them. He did feel mildly sorry for the poor sap who had to take this report, only mildly. Wraith pulled their mask back over their face and snuck into the shadows just across from where Shota was standing. Naomasa noticed something odd the second he got out of the car. The scene was pretty normal, a bunch of people tied up and unconscious, and Eraserhead standing off to the side, trying not to be noticed. Hero reports, particularly the ones concerning underground heroes, were things that often got handed off to Naomasa. He was one of the few cops that seemed to be trusted by almost all the undergrounders in Musudafu, so he had the unfortunate pleasure of dealing with all of the cases concerning the less social ones, which included Eraserhead. Meaning that while the other officers handcuffed and arrested the criminals, he was stuck with talking to a grumpy hero who would probably disappear whenever he felt like. Walking closer he could see that Eraserhead was actually talking to someone, although Naomasa couldn't see anybody in the alleyway. "Hey Eraser, what happened? Deal gone wrong?" Of course he was as curt as ever. "Right, by the way, who were you talking to just now?" Naomasa asked. Surely he wasn't talking into thin air, right? Eraserhead just looked at a spot behind Naomasa, but when he turned around, there was no one there. He turned back to Eraserhead, fully questioning the hero's sanity, and there was someone else standing right next to him. Naomasa stumbled backwards in surprise. The other figure was short, wearing a green hoodie and a pair of bright red shoes. Wait, where had he heard that description before? Eraser, is that? Oh, right, Tsukauchi, meet Wraith. The vigilante gave him an enthusiastic wave. Wraith, the vigilante who had been active for years, only to disappear off the face of the earth last month without a trace. Also this was several blocks outside of their previous range. Naomasa wanted explanations, and why exactly is a vigilante having a friendly conversation with you? He could already feel a headache forming behind his eyes. I'm keeping an eye on them. The statement rung true but did nothing to clear up Naomasa's ever-growing confusion. So you're not going to arrest them? Nope, but they'll be patrolling with me from now on, so get used to seeing them around. The bottle of whiskey hidden away in his office was looking more enticing by the second. Right, okay, got it. He did his best not to focus on the vigilante as he took the report of the crime. Then, as soon as he was done, both Eraserhead and Wraith disappeared into the night. Naomasa stared at the alleyway where they were previously standing. He was absolutely not paid enough for this. Chapter text. Izuku woke up a little slower than normal, which is to say, not instantly. Usually they would have shot awake in the aftermath of one nightmare or another, but it seemed that whatever hand of fate there was had decided to give them a break. Maybe soon they'd finally be able to stop having so many nightmares, although they knew better than to truly hope. Their guardians had been talking with Inui about getting them some therapy, but in the meantime, Izuku just resorted to dealing with it the way they always had, distracting themselves long enough to stop thinking about it. To be fair to Aizawa and Yamada, they weren't aware of most of the nightmares Izuku was having, seeing as they would happen almost every day without fail. Izuku saw no need to trouble anybody with the tame ones. The only times their guardians would know of their nightmares would be if they were particularly disturbing. Not really because Izuku would tell them, more so because even they couldn't stop themselves from crying when those ones happened. They eventually got themselves to get up and get dressed, then wandered into the kitchen, greeting both Shadow and Mop on the way, the latter of which kept meowing as loud as she possibly could until they relented and sat down to pet her. She was probably mad that they had the gall to wake up a few minutes late and thus miss the usual time that they'd play with her, and Shadow whenever she decided to show up. They still couldn't believe it had been over 2 months since they started living here. It had taken a while for them to get used to the apartment. In all honesty, it was only around a week ago that they finally stopped expecting to wake up back at the warehouse, but now they could probably navigate the place blindfolded, provided that the cats didn't get in the way. They walked into the kitchen. Aizawa was already up and drinking coffee. Yamada would take a little longer to wake up as usual, so they'd have to wait for breakfast since Aizawa was forbidden from touching anything in the kitchen that wasn't the coffee maker. They hadn't seen him try to cook anything, but Yamada had told them once that the last time he did the kitchen almost got burnt down. "Morning, kid." Aizawa looked up from his coffee cup tiredly. Neither of them were morning people, it's just that they woke up early anyways. In Aizawa's case it was because he had work to do. In Izuku's it was that they wanted to avoid their nightmares. "Morning, Aizawa." Izuku had to stifle a yawn as they grabbed a cup and filled it to the brim with coffee. Aizawa huffed in amusement. "Finish that before Hisashi wakes up, would you? He's already concerned about my coffee drinking habits. He might hide the coffee maker entirely if he finds out you've been drinking that much." Izuku nodded. Yamada had given up trying to entirely stop them from drinking coffee, but he was sure to get a heart attack if he saw them drinking what might be considered a completely absurd amount of it. Aizawa hadn't tried to stop them at all, just smiled and showed them how to operate the coffee maker, much to the chagrin of Yamada, who kept loudly complaining about how he would have to deal with 2 coffee addicts in the house. The first thing Hisashi saw when he walked into the kitchen was Izuku having a staring contest with Shadow. It was adorable, really. Shadow was just standing on the counter and looking at them unblinkingly like the good void she was, while their face was all scrunched up in concentration as they did their best to keep their eyes open. Meanwhile, Shota was doing his best not to laugh and startle the two. Hisashi took the opportunity to snap a picture of the scene without being noticed before getting started on breakfast. It was only a little while ago that he had noticed Izuku really settling in. Not that they weren't before, but now they seemed particularly comfortable. They had stopped getting jumpy whenever someone walked into the same room as them. And they were far more receptive to physical affection, like the random headpats that Shota would give them every time he walked past, or Hisashi's habit of constantly hugging them. Hisashi's phone also had several pictures of them cuddled up on the couch with the cats and or Shota after a long day. They were also getting less and less overprotective of their notebooks, at least around Hisashi and Shota, even leaving the books alone entirely when previously they would have taken them everywhere they went just to make sure nothing bad happened. They still had a long way to go, of course, but even these little things were vast improvements compared to how they were earlier. By the time they had finished breakfast, Izuku was already telling him about their newest analysis. They had showed him the page in their notebook, but quickly realized that Hisashi couldn't understand a single word in there thanks to that code that Nedzu had helped them create. They continued talking about it anyways and asked him if he'd ever met that particular hero, if he could tell them what they were like, if they were as nice as they seemed, or if he'd ever seen their quirk used a certain way, and even more questions that he was barely able to keep track of. He did the best he could to answer them, but each question answered gave rise to 3 more, and eventually Shota had to practically drag both of them out to the car or else they'd be late. Izuku sat at their desk in the teacher's lounge, switching between studying and translating their analyses. They were determined to finish translating everything before their next lesson with Nedzu. They also spent quite a bit of their time observing the teachers as usual, and all the expected silliness that came with them, although there was one thing that had been bugging them for a while now. They set their maths textbook down and walked over to the couch to talk to Inui, who would always hang out in the teacher's lounge before classes started, despite the fact that he didn't even have a desk in here and usually either sat on the couch or stood near Khan's desk. Inui was currently in a conversation with Kayama, but he looked up when he heard them approaching. "Hey Izuku, got a question." "Why are you in here?" Inui looked a bit confused. "I'm sorry, what do you mean by that?" "You're the guidance counselor, right? Why are you in the teacher's lounge? Shuzenji-san and Tanaka-san don't stay here." "Reasons." For some reason Inui's response caused Kayama to giggle wildly. Inui growled softly at her, but either she didn't get the warning or just didn't care because she pointed towards where Khan was seated. "Reason number 1. She signed, winking at Izuku like she was telling a secret that she shouldn't. They don't need to know that. Inui's voice sounded strained, like he was embarrassed about something. Izuku wasn't sure what exactly was going on, but they figured they should probably drop it if Kayama was looking that excited to talk about it, so they excused themselves and returned to their desk to continue with their studies, making a note in their notebook to check for a possible connection between Inui and Kon. After some time Izuku decided to get some more translating done. They had just finished with the last one from analysis number 8 when they heard it, the soft sound of something sharp skittering over metal. If the room were any kind of busy they might not have heard it. Luckily most of the teachers were in class, leaving Ishiyama as the only one in the lounge, and he was quietly sitting at his desk, reading a novel. You could have heard a pin drop in the room. At first they were confused. What on earth would be making a noise like that? Then they realized that the source of the noise was above them. They looked up and their eyes narrowed in on the vent grate in the ceiling. After all, there wasn't any other metal surface in the room. Was something in the vents? They racked their brain for a bit, trying to think of what could be up there. Then they remembered that Nedzu had a habit of dropping into rooms from the vents. Was he watching from there too? Nedzu-san. The vent grate popped open and a furry paw waved at them from the ceiling. What are you doing? Nedzu dropped down from the vents, gathering information. What else? Information? You mean you were spying on people? From the vents? How did you get in there? They were incredibly curious now. Nedzu smiled sharply. There are several entrances to the vents from certain spots in the school, several in random hallways, one in my office and one in here. Izuku got up and started looking around. Obviously Nedzu wasn't going to show them where the entrance in this room was. That would defeat the purpose of them being hidden, so they looked for any sign of an opening. It would have to be at ground level for ease of access, and there would have to be screws or hinges, but they couldn't find anything like that, so maybe it was a sliding mechanism, in which case there should be a seam in the wall and some evidence of movement. It took them a little while, but eventually they found it, hidden away in a corner. Coincidentally it just so happened to be the same corner that their desk was placed at, or, given the way Nedzu was grinning, perhaps it wasn't a coincidence at all. So if I open this it will give access to the vent system. Izuku poked at the panel a bit, trying to figure out how to open it, when Nedzu stopped them. Nothing will happen like that. It's fingerprint activated. He placed his paw on a specific spot in the wall next to the panel and suddenly the panel slid open, revealing a hole just large enough for a grown adult to crawl through. Izuku stared at it in awe as Nedzu walked into the hole and disappeared. The panel didn't close, however. Did he want them to follow him? They looked around. Ishiyama was still the only person in the room, and he was very purposefully ignoring whatever Nedzu was doing, so they crawled into the vents. Nedzu then pressed a button on the wall of the vents and the panel closed behind them. The tunnel wasn't as cramped as Izuku had initially imagined. They had some room to move and they could probably turn around if they wanted to, which made sense if these vents were constructed with the intention of using them like secret tunnels. Nedzu was a few paces ahead of them, and he was explaining the layout of the vent system. Each entrance was carefully hidden. You could enter or exit through them, but also you could use any of the normal vent grates to drop into any room you liked. The fingerprint system was to prevent anyone from accidentally stumbling upon the entrances, and only 2 people currently had fingerprints registered, Nedzu and Aizawa. Izuku's would have to be added into the system and then they would have complete access to the vents, meaning they could travel anywhere they liked in the school without the notice of others. Izuku nodded along, although they suspected they would quickly get lost if they were left to their own devices. The 2 of them stopped by almost every class, checking in on how things were going. Izuku already knew that people tended to gossip when they thought they couldn't be heard, but they were still stunned about how much information they had heard while passing by the hallways, mostly students gossiping about other students. Eventually they returned to the teacher's lounge. Sitting in the vent in the ceiling, looking through the grate, they could see quite a few of the teachers had returned, including their guardians. An idea formed in their head. They quietly opened the grate and made sure that they weren't going to land on anybody, and then they dropped. Quite a few people were startled by their sudden appearance. The only ones who were unaffected were Aizawa, Kon and Inui, all of whom probably heard them opening the grate. Kuros practically jumped out of their skin, and Izuku definitely heard some colorful commentary from Kayama and Majima. Oh great! Nedzu showed the child how to use the vents. I'm sure that won't cause any issues at all. Kuros's voice was practically dripping with sarcasm. Aizawa grinned at them while Yamada seemed entirely unperturbed by the situation. They supposed he was used enough to Aizawa's antics by now that he wasn't affected. Nedzu was speaking with Majima, presumably about getting Izuku's fingerprints added to the system, and Kayama muttered something that sounded suspiciously like, "Oh god, there's another one." It seemed that the vents were a useful tool indeed. Not only did it allow them to eavesdrop on random conversations, it also meant that they could surprise people by literally dropping in on them. Izuku quietly returned to their desk and went right back to studying, entirely ignoring the mild panic they'd caused, although, instead of studying, they started trying to mentally trace the path they'd taken, making a half-formed mental diagram of the vents. Imagine the chaos they could cause. Izuku grinned. This was gonna be fun. Chapter text. Hazashi hummed to himself as he hung up green streamers around the living room. Today was a very special day. It was Izuku's 10th birthday. Of course that meant that there was going to be a party. Not a big one though. There wasn't really anyone that Izuku had wanted to invite, just himself, Shota, Nimari and the Iida brothers. Everyone was bringing a present, and Nimari was in charge of bringing the cake. Hazashi was decorating. Shota and Izuku were supposed to be helping, but they had gotten distracted when the cats tried to attack the balloons they were putting up. It was actually a complete accident that they found out when Izuku's birthday was. Looking back, he and Shota should probably have asked a while ago, but it was actually Tenya who asked the question. About a week ago, when everyone was hanging out at the apartment, the two had been talking about some show Tenya liked when he mentioned that he had gotten a poster of the main character for his birthday last year. Then, in his usual blunt fashion, asked Izuku what they had planned for their birthday this year. Izuku had been surprised for a while, before answering that they had in fact no plans for their birthday, and that they hadn't celebrated their birthday in a long time. They didn't tell Tenya exactly why, but Hazashi and Shota could guess the various reasons, between having nobody to celebrate with and the general lack of self-worth they had while they were living on their own. That had then prompted Tenya to ask when Izuku's birthday was. It was July 15th. That exchange had launched into everyone planning the party. Hazashi and Nimari were particularly enthusiastic, although they toned it down after Izuku said that they didn't want anything too extravagant. A small celebration was enough for them. Hazashi looked around at the now fully decorated living room. All the decorations were in green, of course. There were streamers hung up on the walls and balloons scattered around. There wasn't much else, and in Hazashi's opinion it looked a bit lacking, but Izuku had been rather insistent on the matter when they had gone to pick out decorations. The table was set with paper plates and plastic cups. There was a bowl of candy and some bottles of juice as well, everything you needed for a kid's party. He had left his present on the table. It didn't really matter if Izuku saw it early, but Shota had hidden his present in their bedroom, making sure there was no chance of anyone finding out what it was before he gave it to Izuku. Hazashi smiled. Shota had been fussing over the present for a while, even though he already knew what he wanted to give them. He had been worried that they wouldn't like it, no matter how many times Hazashi assured him that Izuku would love it. There was a knock on the door and Izuku practically ran to the door to open it, almost tripping over Mop in the process. It was Tenya and Tensai. Tenya had a small card in his hand and Tensai was carrying what seemed to be 2 books of some kind. "Happy birthday, Izuku." Tenya greeted them enthusiastically. Izuku grinned and pulled him inside, then the two of them drifted off into an excited conversation. Tensai chuckled and walked over to Hazashi, setting the books on the table. "You know, Tenya spent hours last night making sure he memorized the sign for birthday." That sounded about right. Tenya had made great progress in learning JSL, and he could understand enough to carry out a conversation with Izuku, although that did mean that about half of the signs he knew focused on quirks and the related scientific terminology. There was another knock on the door, and since Izuku was preoccupied, Hazashi went to open the door. Nimari stood outside balancing a box, presumably with the cake inside, in one hand while she knocked with the other. "Hello. I hope I'm not too late. I had to take a little detour to grab this," she said, lifting a very small box, like the kind you put jewelry in. "Nope, you're right on time." Hazashi took the cake box from her and set it on the table. She wished Izuku a happy birthday and brought both children over so that they could start the celebrations. Izuku stared at the cake in front of them. It was a vanilla cake covered in green icing with images of various heroes decorating the sides. The top of the cake had a nice border with the words, "Happy Birthday Izuku," piped on top in neat handwriting, and a candle in the shape of a number 10 was lit. It was so much more than they had ever expected. Despite what Yamada said, everything about this party felt grander than anything Izuku had ever seen. "Go on, blow out the candle, make a wish," Kayama encouraged them. Izuku closed their eyes. What did they want to wish for? They racked their brain trying to think of something, but what did they want that they didn't already have? They had a home, they had mentors who cared about them, they were studying their passion, they were training to be a hero. They had everything they had dreamed of since they were little. What more did they even wish for? Then, an idea popped into their mind. That was the perfect wish. Izuku blew out the candle. As they did, they heard Kayama start singing Happy Birthday, and one by one everyone else joined in, and they knew in their heart and soul, they had made the right wish. Yamada handed them a knife to cut the cake with, and they carefully cut slices for everybody, although, they probably didn't have to be so precise. With the small number of people, there would be more than enough cake left over for people to grab seconds. The entire group slowly struck off into individual conversations. Izuku returned to talking with Tenya. "What did you wish for anyways?" Tenya asked. Izuku thought about telling him before shaking their head. "If I tell you, it won't come true. That doesn't make any sense. If anything, it's more likely to come true if you tell someone," Tenya reasoned, ever the rational thinker. "Well, this wish is different, it's important, so I have to keep it a secret." Izuku wasn't quite sure what the consequences of telling their wish to someone would be, but any response they could think of wasn't all that good. Tenya mumbled something about that not being rational, but was cut short when Yamada loudly called everyone over so that they could give Izuku their presents. Tenya brightened up at that and practically dragged Izuku over to where the adults were sitting. Izuku was a little startled when Tenya suddenly handed them a card. It was a rather nice-looking light blue card. It said Happy Birthday in Tenya's neat handwriting, and there were some balloons and a generic birthday cake doodled on the front. The inside had a small note about how great of a friend Izuku was and that Tenya was honored to be considered their friend. They smiled and thanked him, to which he beamed. "I made that myself, I didn't even have to get my brother to help me." He seemed really proud of that accomplishment. Tenya's brother handed them 2 books. One was a mystery novel that Izuku had shown an interest for in the past, and the other was a book on the history of quirks. "The novel is from me, the history book was Tenya's idea," he explained. Izuku took both with shining eyes. As much as they wanted to start reading the books right here, they still had 2 more gifts left. They set the books down on the table. Kayama gave them a little purple jewelry box. Inside was a silver locket. "It's empty right now, so you can put whatever you like in there," she said excitedly. Izuku turned it over in their hands. It was really pretty. The outside of the locket had an elegant pattern of stars engraved onto it. They had no idea on what to put in it right now, but they could always figure that out later. Yamada gave them a really nice-looking notebook, the kind they could fit in their pocket. It had a black cover and a small pocket where they could keep a pen, so that it's easier for you to take notes on the fly. Izuku smiled. This was going to be used quite a lot. Everyone wished them a happy birthday once again, and after some more small talk, Kayama and the Iidas left, at which point Aizawa tapped their shoulder. "Well, now that they're gone, you have one last present." Izuku looked confused, which made Aizawa smile in amusement. "You didn't forget about my gift, did you?" Izuku hadn't thought Aizawa had gotten them a gift. They hadn't seen any hint of another gift laying around. Had he been keeping it hidden somewhere? Aizawa left the room to fetch it, and when he got back he was holding long metal bow staff. Izuku's eyes widened. Did this mean what they thought it meant? Aizawa must have seen their shocked expression because he grinned and nodded his head. "I figured I've kept you benched long enough." He handed the staff to Izuku. It wasn't too heavy, probably made for speed rather than damage. They made sure they wouldn't hit anything and experimentally swung it. It would take some time to get used to, but they could definitely work with it. Izuku put the staff down and hugged Aizawa, who seemed surprised but returned the hug. Yamada chuckled. "I told you they would love it." By the time the living room was cleaned up, it was starting to get dark, so Izuku took their gifts and returned to their room. They carefully put away their gifts. The books all went on their shelf along with Tenya's card. The locket in its box sat on their nightstand and the bow staff was put in the closet next to the rest of their vigilante gear. Izuku looked out of their window at the last of the setting sun and smiled. They were feeling over the moon. Maybe it was because this was their first birthday in 5 years. Maybe it was because of the people around them, but this day felt truly special. They had so many things they couldn't wait to do, so many things that they worked towards, and today, they were 1 year older, and 1 year closer to their goals, but for now they would sleep, hopefully not have any nightmares, and wake up tomorrow for another day spent with the people who made them feel safe. I wish that I will always have a family like this. Chapter text. Izuku dodged a punch as they tried to keep a distance from the lady in front of them. Her porcupine quirk was a real problem since their staff kept getting caught in the quills that made up her hair. They had to wait for an opening, and soon enough the opportunity presented itself. She got distracted by one of her friends getting thrown into a light pole by Eraser's capture weapon. Izuku made 2 quick strikes, one to her legs, causing her to fall, and one to the chin, knocking her out. They sighed and looked over the situation. Several unconscious or tied-up people were scattered around them. 2 rival gangs had started a fight in the middle of the street, about 3 people on each team. Eraser had noticed it first, and since de-escalation hadn't worked, Izuku joined in the ensuing fight. Luckily no sane person would be wandering the streets past midnight, so there were no civilians at risk. It wasn't a particularly tough fight since, while they were fighting 6 people, those people were also fighting each other. That didn't mean that they got out of it unharmed, of course. Izuku definitely had a bruise or 2 from getting literally thrown into a pile of trash by someone with a strength quirk, and Eraser had a cut on his hand from a lucky hit from someone's knife. Izuku hopped up to the rooftop and, after making sure the police were called and telling them what happened, Eraser soon joined them and the pair set off down their usual patrol route. Izuku had to adjust their pace a few times. The extra weight of the new staff strapped to their back was taking quite some time to get used to. A month still hadn't been enough. Even their old sign pole had been hollow, and therefore it was much lighter and far easier to run around with. It was nice to be back to properly being a vigilante, and not just Eraser's shadow, although there was the one problem of Yamada constantly fretting over them now that they were getting involved in the fights, and they were sure they were going to be fussed at for the bruises they'd managed to get today. On the bright side, it was always funny to see Yamada worry over Aizawa, who always looked like a disgruntled cat whenever he couldn't escape Yamada's notice. A scream rang through the air and immediately they were sprinting in that direction, Eraser running right alongside them. They quickly reached the alleyway that the scream emanated from, and Izuku looked over the situation in the split second it took to jump down and get themselves involved. A young woman with bruises and cuts all over her face and arms was cowering away from a man who was yelling at her. Something about her being ungrateful, but he was quickly cut off by Izuku landing on top of him and knocking him out with their staff. The woman still looked terrified, flinching away as they got closer. They held out their hand to help her up. She took it cautiously. Eraser had jumped down next to them and was calling the police. He asked the woman some questions. Apparently that was her ex-boyfriend and he had been stalking her for some time after their breakup. She had confronted him, and he got violent. They stayed until the police showed up to arrest the man and take the woman in for questioning and to get her to a hospital, at which point they left to finish patrolling. Shota smiled to himself as Wraith hid in the shadows of the alleyway. They had just stopped a mugging and were waiting for the police officer that arrived to arrest the criminal. At some point the officer worked up the courage to ask about the vigilante. Who is that behind you?" Shota internally cackled as he heard the faint footsteps of Wraith slipping into the shadows. "There's no one there," he said, completely deadpan. The officer pointed at the alleyway. "Yes, there is there." The officer blinked a few times, realizing that Wraith was no longer in sight. "I could have sworn there was." "You're probably seeing things. There's no one else in this alleyway." Shota only felt a little guilt for making the poor officer question their sanity, but it was far outweighed by the sheer joy he felt seeing them look around frantically as if searching for a ghost. The second the officer left, completely bewildered and muttering something about needing more sleep, Wraith stepped out of the shadows. Shota could swear that they were grinning under their mask. They always had fun messing with whatever poor sap arrived on the scene. The only person they couldn't pull tricks on was Tsukauchi, on account of his quirk triggering whenever Shota tried to play dumb about Wraith's antics. Then again, It was likely only a matter of time until Wraith found a way to bypass it. Until then, however, they settled for making him question his career choices by being as annoying as they possibly could be. Shota was fairly sure the detective's face fell every time he saw them at a crime scene. It was almost 3 in the morning by the time they got back home. Hazashi was probably asleep by now. Shota smiled. At least he would be able to bandage the cut on his hand without that overgrown cockatoo looking over his shoulder and lecturing him about getting hurt. Izuku had immediately gone to bed. Good, they had analysis lessons tomorrow and being tired during that would spell disaster for everyone. Izuku laid on their bed, Shadow curled up beside them. Today had been eventful, they supposed they should get some sleep. They couldn't wait for their lesson tomorrow. It wasn't that they didn't enjoy learning their normal school subjects, but analysis was just so fun, and Nedzu was an amazing teacher. There was so much he'd taught them about that they'd never even considered adding into their analyses. It all seemed kind of obvious in hindsight. Of course they got plenty of opportunities to put what they learned into practice, not only because Nedzu allowed them to analyze various students, mostly the third years, but it also helped them greatly on their patrols, being able to identify their opponents' quirks quicker than ever, meaning they spent less time assessing situations before they interjected. Of course Nedzu didn't know about that second reason, but they still figured it was only a matter of time, especially now that they were fighting criminals and no longer staying hidden. Izuku closed their eyes. They'd probably get a few hours of sleep, not that much less than what they usually got, their nightmares as persistent as ever, but tomorrow would be a great day, even if they had a small, nagging feeling in the back of their mind that something was going to go sideways. A small pile of police reports sat on the desk in the principal's office, some dated as far back as 3 years ago, all dealing with a curious vigilante. Nedzu never normally paid attention to these things, best to let the police department deal with vigilantes however they saw fit, but he'd recently had a talk with Tsukauchi, not anything particular, just business, but he had mentioned a particular thorn in his side, a vigilante by the name of Wraith. According to Tsukauchi, the vigilante had recently taken to following Eraserhead around. Again, not really something Nedzu would look into, if the vigilante's description hadn't rung several bells, namely, the red shoes, the same red shoes that Izuku had informed him were worn by quirkless people. Now, what would it mean that a quirkless vigilante starts following Eraserhead around a month and a half after Aizawa takes a quirkless child under his care? And digging further into the case he found out that the hero originally put on the Wraith case was Eraserhead himself. Things were clicking into place. Nedzu had thought that they were far more familiar with each other than should have been for only having met the day that Aizawa saved Izuku's life. It made far more sense that they'd known each other since he was put on Wraith's trail. Now, the question was, what to do with this information? As a hero, he should tell Tsukauchi, let the police, and Aizawa, deal with whatever the fallout is. But, as Izuku's mentor, he couldn't bring himself to tell anybody, not if it meant losing his protege. Of course, he would have a stern talk with Izuku tomorrow, or at least, try to understand the reason they chose this path at such a young age. And as for who else would find out, that would have to be discussed with Izuku themselves. Tomorrow was going to be a very interesting lesson indeed. Chapter text. Izuku practically bounced around as they walked into UA. As usual, the hallways were empty, save for the few staff who were headed towards their designated areas. Izuku on the other hand had a different route. They split away from Yamada and Aizawa and found the secret panel located nearby the front doors. Nedzu had added their fingerprints to the vent system's database, meaning they had full access to the secret passages that made up the vents. They didn't have to use them to get around, but it was fun, and they would be lying if they said it didn't amuse them to pop out of the ceiling and surprise the unsuspecting staff. They made their way to the principal's office for their analysis lesson, pausing to greet Tanaka as they passed over the cafeteria and took a small detour to say hi to Shuzenji in the infirmary. They would have gone to the teacher's lounge to say hello to everyone there, but it was an inconvenient detour and they didn't want to be late. Soon enough they reached the principal's office and dropped in near Nedzu. He appeared to be organizing some papers. Izuku paid it no mind however since he always had paperwork to deal with, one of the side effects of running a school, so they sat down in their chair with only a small glance at the papers. They looked like police reports, perhaps it was about some operation or raid that Nedzu was helping strategize. Good morning, Nedzu-sensei, Izuku said, taking their notebook out of their bag. It was a new one, their 10th actually. Their 9th was mostly full of entries on the students. It was the same plain black cover as their last two. It made it a lot easier to keep track of which notes were analysis and which notes were for normal subjects, since those notebooks were always colorful and usually hero-themed. Good morning, Izuku. Nedzu greeted them, putting the papers back in his desk. Again, Izuku tried to catch a sneaky glance at the paper's contents, but Nedzu kept them face down the entire time. The only thing they could see is that one of the reports was dated for last night. That was odd. Maybe it was important. Surely he would say something if it was truly important, or at least, he never cared if they happened to catch a glimpse of whatever he was working on. However, Izuku was definitely curious. What could possibly be so important that Nedzu was actively hiding it from them? Their analysis lesson started out rather simple, a short test on the different types of quirks and their technical classifications. It seemed a bit too easy for what Nedzu normally gave them, but perhaps it was their imagination. Izuku completed the test quickly. They moved on to talking about the situational effectiveness of different quirks, including discussions on how quirks that relied on external factors, namely kinesis quirks, transmutation quirks, and any quirk that required a situational trigger, were easily taken down by simply depriving them of the necessary material or circumstance. On the other hand, given how almost anything can be found anywhere, it was much harder to expect where the user would get their ammunition from. For example, someone with a hydrokinesis quirk fighting in the snow could use the water that forms from the snow melting around their feet. Meanwhile, quirks that relied on internal functions like mental quirks, most mutation quirks or quirks that relied on the user's body, were far more reliable since, unless you were willing to cause permanent physical or mental damage to the person, it was a lot trickier to nullify. But reliable also meant predictable. A touch-based quirk simply requires you to stay out of reach of your opponent in order to avoid being affected. Then the discussion took a disconcertingly familiar turn as they started to discuss the most effective way to take down a series of quirks that sounded identical to some of the quirks that the criminals they had fought last night during patrol had. At first it was easy to brush off. A strength quirk was common enough, a transformation quirk with specific details. Okay. Maybe Nedzu was just pulling from random police files, and then it kept happening and they were starting to get suspicious. What would be the best way of taking down someone with a mutation quirk, specifically that of a porcupine? Nedzu's eyes gleamed sharply, and Izuku resisted the urge to hide under the chair. If Nedzu knew about Wraith, they were in big trouble. Izuku started scanning the area for escape routes. I suppose it would be to deal with them at long range, perhaps a gun, or a non-contact quirk. They tried to play it cool, desperately hoping this was all a coincidence. What if all you had was a melee weapon? Izuku did not like where this was going. What kind of melee weapon exactly? I'm sure a knife wouldn't be of much use. They could feel the smile on their face grow strained, although they hoped Nedzu hadn't picked up on it. A bow staff. Oh shit, oh shit, oh no. Nedzu knew. He knew everything. Izuku's mind went into overdrive. They forced a smile and tried to answer the question as if they had no idea what Nedzu was hinting at. A bow staff. Well, I think that would be a pretty inconvenient weapon to fight this quirk with. It's long and relatively thin. It would probably get stuck in the person's quills, but I suppose if you could catch them off guard you could find an area without quills to hit. The vents were the closest option, but the panels could be controlled remotely from Nedzu's computer. Izuku wouldn't be surprised if he had already locked them. The next option was the door, but it was the middle of the day and close to lunchtime. Running out in the middle of the hallway like that would draw attention. Nedzu nodded. That would work, although I imagine it would be quite difficult to accomplish without a teammate. They would have to take the risk, but where would they run to? The teacher's lounge maybe. Either Aizawa or Yamada would be in there at this time, but what if the other teachers had been told? As skilled as their guardians were, they didn't think they could distract 8 fully trained pro heroes. The better option would be to make a break for it and hide somewhere on school grounds. Izuku tried to divert the direction of the conversation away from a retelling of last night's events. Maybe, but assuming that you were alone, it would still be your best bet given the circumstances you have laid out for me. Nedzu had cameras everywhere. There was no way they wouldn't be found if they tried to hide here. But the school gates were also operated by an electronic system. It wouldn't open without an ID and they didn't have one. There was no need since Aizawa and Yamada always accompanied them into and out of the school. Well, that doesn't matter. You weren't alone. Izuku froze. There was no way to avoid the inevitable. They would probably be turned over to the police custody. Aizawa and Yamada, they'd probably get in trouble as well. They did know who they were and never reported it. This was the end of their dream, wasn't it? I don't understand. This is a hypothetical. Why are you addressing me directly? Maybe if they played dumb enough. We both know why Izuku, or should I call you Wraith? Izuku sighed. What are you going to do? Nothing. Izuku had to pause and process that response. Nothing. Nothing. Nedzu confirmed. I would hate to lose my star pupil to such trivial concerns. Izuku didn't know what just happened, but they were thanking every higher power out there that Nedzu had such an unconventional sense of morals. Of course, the question of who else to tell, well, I'm certain my staff would find out sooner or later. However, when that happens is up to you, but it would be better to do it soon. Izuku nodded. That was understandable. When would be a good time? Maybe it would be better to rip the band-aid off. Now. We tell them now. Are you sure? Yes. Shota wasn't expecting anything to go wrong today. Nothing unexpected at all, just a normal day of teaching. And so far, that was what had happened. It was getting close to the end of the school day. Everyone was once again gathered in the teacher's lounge, chattering away, while Shota was just waiting for the day to end so that he could go home and chill out with the cats, Hazashi and Izuku. When suddenly, the goddamn rat drops in, followed shortly by Izuku. I believe we require everyone's attention. There is something Izuku would like to say. What? Shota glanced at Izuku, who looked incredibly sheepish. What was Nedzu talking about? I believe some of you are familiar with a vigilante called Wraith. Oh hell no. Shota tensed, and he saw Hasashi sit up straight next to him. Nedzu knew. He knew and Izuku was going to tell everyone here. They made eye contact. Shota looked concerned. If Nedzu was forcing them say this, forget the fact that he was in a room full of pro-heroes. Shota was going to walk over there and strangle that stupid rat until his eyes fell out. Izuku gave him a smile, a reassurance that they were doing this willingly. Still, he kept an eye on Nedzu, just in case. What's so important about a random vigilante? Majima asked, not looking up from their work. Because, Izuku began, pausing as they decided how to word this, because I am them. And the uproar that erupted in the room could have rivaled one of Hazashi's yells, a cacophony of questions and exclamations that only ceased when Khan hit its desk with such force that Shota was surprised that the desk didn't break. It looked like it couldn't decide whether to be impressed or angry. Oh right, as an underground hero stationed in Musudafu, Khan would have been part of the group that was keeping an eye out for Wraith before Shota was personally put on the task of hunting them down. You're saying that the vigilante who has been running circles around all the undergrounders of Musudafu for 3 years, Khan said through gritted teeth, has been a god damn child. Yes. Izuku shifted uncomfortably. Khan shook its head. It sighed. Damn kid, you sure or something? Thank you. Shota relaxed as he saw everyone else slowly start talking a lot less chaotically, apparently having had time to process the information. Izuku was asked a few questions, although nothing too personal, mostly just random things. Hey Izuku, Kuros asked, where'd you learn how to fight? Well, you see, I didn't, not for a while. Really? But you can fight now. Yeah, Aizawa taught me. He also didn't let me fight anyone until I learned. They looked a little miffed at that. Shota spoke up. Well, I'm not going to let some kid fight criminals when they can't even throw a punch. Somehow, nothing went wrong. Some of the others had reservations about letting a child put themselves in danger like that, but it only took Izuku arguing with them for a solid 10 minutes before they realized that they were going to fight crime no matter what, and the only real difference was whether Shota was able to keep an eye on them or not. Nimari was a bit miffed that they hadn't told her before, but laughed it off, saying she understood why. By the time they left for home, Izuku could feel themselves tearing up from all the kindness they were getting. They had been nervous, but, after the initial outcry, everything had been fine. Everything was going to be fine. Chapter text. Izuku was practically bouncing around their room as they got ready for the day. The weekend was always fun, since they just got to hang out with their guardians all day, whether that was going outside or just staying at home and watching a movie. Sometimes Tenya and his brother would visit, or maybe Kayama. Today though, was just going to be them, Aizawa and Yamada, and these days always felt. Actually, Izuku could never quite put their finger on the feeling they felt, but if they had to describe it, they would say that it was cozy. They rooted through their closet and decided on wearing one of their joke shirts. They had to dig it out from next to their wraith costume. They really needed to put that thing in its own box, now that it had more parts to it that took up way too much space in their small closet. The extra stuff was some padded armor that they wore underneath their hoodie and jeans, courtesy of Majima, who had insisted that if Izuku was going to go around beating up criminals, that they at least have some armor to protect them. It wasn't impenetrable by any means, but it allowed them to take a few more hits than they normally would, and it wasn't bulky, so they still had their full range of movement. Izuku was honestly surprised at how little changed after they told everyone about their vigilantism. The only real thing that changed was that everyone asked them about their patrols whenever they got the chance. They knew from sneaking around the vents that some of the teachers, namely Kayama, Kato, Inui and Ishiyama, had started secretly collecting any and all articles about Wraith that they could find and were putting them in a secret file, although Izuku thought that their file looked suspiciously like a scrapbook. They scooped Shadow off their bed and wandered into the kitchen, cat in hand. They were immediately greeted with the mouth-watering smell of katsudon. Yamada must have gotten up early and made breakfast. Izuku loved katsudon. They remembered Inko frequently making it for them when they were little, and even though those memories were rather bitter and a bit hazy to them now, it was still their favorite dish. The vague memories of the taste were always rather odd. Before, they would have said that Inko made the best katsudon in the world, but now they couldn't say the same. Maybe it was because their opinion of her had soured so much over the last half a year, but Izuku honestly couldn't imagine her katsudon being even half as good as the one Yamada made. They set Shadow on the counter and grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine, earning them a defeated sigh from Yamada as he gave an annoyed glare towards where Aizawa was drinking his own coffee and smiling at the scene before him. The three of them talked about what they wanted to do today while they ate breakfast. Several ideas were thrown around, but in the end, they decided on going to the park. Izuku hurried back to their room after breakfast. They quickly grabbed their pocket notebook and then waited impatiently for the extra few minutes it took for their guardians to get ready. Aizawa had to remind them several times to slow down as they made their way down the building's staircase, although Izuku knew they wouldn't trip. And they were practically vibrating in their seat on the drive to the park, amusing Yamada to no end because, even though they'd gone to this park several times by now, they always had the same reaction, overexcited impatience. When they got to the park, Izuku barely waited until the car had stopped before getting down, followed shortly by Yamada and Aizawa. The three of them set off to what had quickly become Izuku's favorite spot in the park. It was near one of the big trees that dotted the park, but it was in the far corner of the park, so they usually weren't disturbed by any other people. And on the rare occasion someone wandered by, Izuku and Aizawa usually just slipped behind the tree, wanting to avoid any unnecessary social interaction, and a combination of their stealth skills and the relatively large shadow cast by the tree made it almost impossible to spot them unless they wanted to be spotted. Today, however, was a calm day. Izuku could see several people in the middle of the park, families having picnics, a few couples going on dates, groups of friends hanging out, kids playing with sticks. It seemed that everyone was taking advantage of the nice weather to have some fun. After some time the discussion briefly turned to their studies and Izuku excitedly talked about all the progress they'd made. In fact, they were already learning material taught in the first year of middle school, and even more excitedly they talked about the latest quirks they'd analyzed. Yamada matched their enthusiasm, interjecting with jokes and gossip, while Aizawa settled for headpats and half-hidden smiles to show that he was listening. It was just Shota and Izuku at the moment. Hisashi had run off to get lunch for all of them, although he was taking a long time. He smiled as Izuku wandered around the area, looking at whatever odd things caught their eye, usually a bug, or a cool rock. They always showed him whatever they found. It was adorable really, and he did try to be interested, even if he couldn't really match Hisashi's enthusiasm, but he got the feeling that they understood what he was trying to do anyway. It was times like these when it was so obvious that Izuku was still just a child. Shota had honestly worried a bit when he and Hisashi had first taken them in. After all, spending 5 years of your childhood fending for yourself and 2 of those years being a vigilante, in addition to all the discrimination, well, that could certainly mess someone up. And at first, Izuku had acted far too mature for their age, and in some ways they still did, but it was nice to know that underneath all the skills and genius, they were still capable of being a kid. Shota suspected it had something to do with the fact that they were finally getting some therapy. When Hisashi returned, lunch in one hand, and a box of cookies in the other, so that's what took him so long. He must have run to the bakery all the way down the street. Shota shook his head fondly. No doubt this was entirely on impulse, or he would have told them where he was going before he left. They all sat down under the tree, ate lunch, and then had a peaceful conversation while munching cookies, for approximately 2 minutes. Suddenly, Hisashi snatched a cookie right out of Shota's hand. Of course, he tried to get it back, but to no avail. Hisashi held the cookie triumphantly. That was, until Izuku snuck up on Hisashi and stole the cookie for themselves, taking a bite out of it so that nobody could steal it back. In the end, however, the actual cookie was forgotten in favor of a game of tag. It was honestly a bit unfair. After all, 2 of them had a major advantage. Then again, Hisashi didn't seem to mind being it. For most of the time, Shota didn't really mind that either, since it kept the game relatively sane. When he or Izuku was it, things got a little crazy. After all, the 2 of them parkoured across the city almost every night, so climbing the tree to escape each other was child's play. He did panic a bit when, at some point, Izuku fell from one of the lower branches, but they only got a scratch on their hand. Luckily, Shota always carried plasters with him. That wasn't even a habit that had formed because of Izuku. No, he started carrying them shortly after he started dating Hisashi, who used to be, and still sometimes was, a major klutz. By the time they left the park, the sun was starting to set, and it was almost completely dark by the time they got to the apartment. Izuku was rather tired, and they ended up flopping onto the couch the second they got the chance. Soon joined by the cats, they heard a soft laugh and the clicking of a photo being taken, no doubt by Yamada. They smiled to themselves as they half listened to whatever conversation their guardians were having, and they were flooded once again with that cozy feeling. But cozy wasn't enough to describe the feeling. No, it was every good thing in the world wrapped into one. The feeling of a warm blanket on a cold night, or the sound of laughter and energy. They vaguely remembered feeling this feeling before, but it must have been so long ago that they'd forgotten why. They frowned. It had been bothering them for quite some time now, the mystery of this feeling. They had been trying to puzzle it out, but if only they could remember why they'd felt it before. They dug through their hazy memories of their early life. Every time they remembered that feeling, it was in a memory of one of their biological parents, or their home, but they couldn't ever remember the feeling being as strong as it was now. Or perhaps that was due to the fact that they were so young back then, that they could no longer recall how strongly they'd felt it, or maybe it felt stronger now because they hadn't felt it in a long time. Still, Izuku was confused. If they had associated this feeling with their parents, at least, before they were abandoned, then logically this feeling would have something to do with family, so why would they be feeling it now? Then it hit them. It was because this was their family now. They'd spent so long without one, that they hadn't even realized how quickly they'd gained one. Looking back, they could practically pinpoint the exact moment they'd started considering Aizawa and Yamada as family. It was shortly after they'd started mentoring them, even before Izuku had started living with them. They'd looked up to them as a source of encouragement and comfort, just like they used to with their old parents. Did that mean they thought of the 2 as their parents? Izuku hesitated on that. For one, they had no idea what that would mean for them. For another, these realizations had happened in the span of a few minutes, and they weren't entirely ready to grapple with the mental spiral they'd likely go down if they accepted these new understandings as fact. But, no, they couldn't deny it. The issue was, what would they do with this new information? They supposed they could think over it more. Yes, that is what they'd do. Hisashi had just finished cleaning up the plates from dinner when it happened. Shota and Izuku were seated on the couch, simply relaxing with the cats, and Hisashi joined them soon afterwards. They were having a discussion about some case or another. He wasn't really paying attention. Shota had been complaining about Izuku being reckless, and Izuku indignantly responded. Actually, I knew exactly what I was doing. That may be, but it was still reckless. If I wasn't there to get you out of that fight, who knows what could have happened. Shota sounded entirely too exasperated, but Hizashi could hear the underlying worry in his tone. Sorry Dad, I won't. Izuku froze, and it took Hizashi's tired brain a few seconds to process why. Did you just call me Dad? Shota sounded shocked. Honestly, so was Hizashi. Yeah, they had both considered Izuku as their kid ever since they took them in, but they never really acknowledged it to anyone but themselves. After all, they didn't really want to overstep any boundaries. Izuku quickly apologized, even though they really didn't need to. It was an accident. Well, I was thinking earlier, and I guess it was on my mind, but, you two are basically parents to me. I just didn't realize it until earlier today. Sorry, that's awkward, isn't it? To say Hizashi was overjoyed was an understatement, and he could see Shota smiling as well. Izuku looked so embarrassed, however. Don't worry about it, little listener. We don't mind. Hizashi was quick to reassure them. You don't? Yeah, I mean, we both think of you as our kid anyways, so it's really not an issue. Izuku looked stunned at that, and looked at Shota for confirmation. He just nodded. Hizashi could see Izuku's eyes start to water. He internally prepared himself for the waterworks that would inevitably follow. The kid had a rather endearing habit of expressing almost every strong emotion through tears. Inevitably, the three of them ended up in a cuddle pile on the couch. They were all quiet for some time. Hizashi knew what he wanted to ask. Hey Izuku. Yeah Papa, Izuku asked, and Hizashi had to blink away some tears himself. Do you want to be our kid, like, officially? You mean? Izuku's eyes lit up as they realized what Hizashi was asking. Yes, do you want us to adopt you? Shota asked. You don't have to give your answer now. You can think about it. Yes. Izuku interrupted him, and the tears were back in their eyes. Hizashi smiled. It was going to take some time, what with all the procedures and paperwork, but they'd finally be able to call Izuku their kid, and looking at them, they were just as excited about the idea. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind for Izuku. They didn't quite understand all the legal procedures that they had to go through for the adoption. It involved a bunch of paperwork and meetings with people that asked really personal questions. They were tired of the whole thing, but all the hassle was completely worth it just to call Aizawa and Yamada their fathers. They had taken both of their fathers' last names, since they hadn't changed their names when they got married. And after the final piece of paper was signed, they were officially Aizawa Yamada Izuku. Not that they would be using their new family name that often, since everyone they knew just called them Izuku. Izuku must have fallen asleep somewhere during the drive home because they honestly didn't remember much of what happened after they left the office, just getting into the car and listening to their dads talk before they drifted off to the soft hum of the car's engine. They still couldn't believe that it was official. While they had been referring to Aizawa and Yamada as their dad and papa for about a month now, which was how long the adoption process had been, but to have it be legalized and completely official, well, they could cry tears of joy just thinking about it. Izuku was woken up by soft laughter. Papa was smiling at them from the passenger seat. Izuku smiled back sleepily and uncurled from their spot in the backseat. They realized that the car had stopped moving. They looked out the window and realized that they'd reached the apartment. Izuku practically sprinted up the stairs and all the way to their door, bouncing in place while they waited for their parents to catch up. Dad had just smiled and unlocked the door. Izuku. Dad caught their attention as he opened the door. Yeah, welcome home kid. Izuku grinned as they were greeted by mop and shadow curling around their legs. This was their home now. It had been for some time, but now it felt permanent, like it was here and it was never going away. They flopped on the couch. It was Saturday, so their parents didn't have work tomorrow. They had a feeling it was going to be spent relaxing, hopefully, although things were never calm for long, and it was probably going to be particularly chaotic when they returned to UA on Monday. Izuku remembered Kayama bragging to the other staff last week about being an aunt soon. Izuku frowned. Something about that didn't sit quite right with them, but they brushed the thought aside, instead choosing to focus on the warm feeling of finally having a family to call their own. That morning, Hizashi woke up to a loud crash and a startled yell in the living room. It was barely morning, even Shota hadn't woken up yet. The two of them rushed out of their room and turned on the living room light, expecting the worst, only to see Izuku, with a cut on their hand, holding a furious mop and standing over what used to be a mug. Izuku looked up at them sheepishly. They set mop down far away from the ceramic shards. She promptly hissed and ran off to the top of the bookshelf so that she could glare down at them disapprovingly. Couldn't sleep, so I went to make coffee, and then I kinda tripped over mop. They explained, red with embarrassment. I probably shouldn't have tried to walk around in the dark with the cats wandering around. Hazashi sighed and started cleaning up the broken mug. At least there wasn't any coffee in it, while Shota grabbed the first aid kit to tend to the cut on Izuku's hand. And since everyone was awake already and it was so close to morning that there was really no point in going back to bed, Hazashi got started on making breakfast. Only one day after they finished the adoption, only one day with Izuku officially being their child, and there was already chaos. He wouldn't have it any other way. Izuku heard a knock on the door at around midday. They opened the door and was immediately tackled by a blur of movement. Izuku fell to the floor and got a face full of blue hair, followed by guffawing and wheezing from the blur's older brother. They were surprised. Tenya was not normally a touchy person. In fact, they could count on one hand the number of times he'd initiated a hug with anyone. Izuku pried him off themselves and got to their feet. "Good afternoon, Tenya," Izuku said, smiling at him. Tenya always gave greetings that were at least semi-formal, and even if they personally preferred to be casual, they always matched his style because it made Tenya's eyes light up happily. "Good afternoon, cousin," Tenya said with a small smile on his face. "Cousin?" Izuku asked. "Your fathers are my uncles. That makes us cousins." Izuku had to dodge out of the way of Tenya's arm as he unconsciously chopped it through the air while he spoke. "So your brother would be also my cousin?" Izuku frowned. No, that didn't sound right. Ida Tensai was their father's friend. It would be weird to call him their cousin. Actually, I think I'm just going to call him my uncle. Tenya looked like he was doing a complicated maths problem in his mind. "But he's my brother. That would also make me." Tenya shook his head. "You know what? I'm not even going to try. Following the logic seems to lead us to uncomfortable results no matter what we do." Izuku and Tenya stared at each other for a few seconds, before silently agreeing to never think about the weirdness of their new family tree ever again. They ended up chatting for a short while before the brothers had to leave. Apparently Tensai was in the area for hero work, and they had just stopped by to congratulate Izuku on being adopted. Shota could barely think with the loud chatter that encompassed the teacher's lounge. It seemed that everyone had something to say to Izuku, positive things, but still, it was all a bit loud. Shota hated it. It would be bearable if his insufferable, he hates to admit it, friends wouldn't try and talk to him about it. He basically crawled into his sleeping bag under his desk and stayed put. At least anyone who tried to bother him there usually got the hint thanks to his well-practiced glare. Still, it looked like there was something bothering Izuku. They kept glancing over at Nimari and frowning. She was bragging to everyone who would listen about officially being an aunt. Shota didn't know why his kid looked so distressed, but he hated it. He shuffled out from under his desk and made eye contact with Izuku, just to gauge the situation, but they seemed deep in thought, and started writing something down. Whatever was going through their head seemed to have turned into some kind of puzzle. It was a weird habit really. Izuku treated a lot of things in life like one of their analyses, people especially, but it somehow got results. Although when it came to people, Shota was glad that they never told their thoughts to the people in question, because that would surely make some people angry. The kid needed some people skills. Perhaps Nimari and Hazashi could teach them, because it definitely wasn't going to be him. Izuku looked at the notes scribbled in the corner of their book. They were supposed to be chemistry equations, but it was starting to look like psychology reports. They sighed as they heard more commotion. Kuros was desperately trying to get their wife to shut up. Meanwhile Kayama just kept talking endlessly. It seemed that she was really excited to be an aunt. Izuku frowned again. Kayama's bragging was getting under their skin. Something kept bothering them, and they had no idea why on earth nobody else was saying anything. They knew that Kayama visited them sometimes, but other than that, she didn't really do more than the rest of the staff. What gave her and her alone extended family status? No, they figured that all of the staff, save for Dad and Papa, were the same status in their mind. now to figure out what exactly that status was. Yeah, they felt a close connection to them, but was it close enough for Izuku to consider them family, or maybe it wasn't and they were overthinking things, but they really didn't know. On the other hand, everyone had been so nice to them, and they had been super supportive of their dreams and even offered to help, and they were all really protective of them, or maybe that's just because they're a child. Izuku sighed and put their head in their hands. They had just gotten over one crisis of family, they really didn't need another one. Chapter text. Izuku scribbled in their notebook. To the average onlooker it would look like they were dutifully taking notes on a particularly interesting physics theorem. To anybody that looked closer they would realize that they were writing in their secret code, and to anyone who knew the code, it was apparent that Izuku was in fact making notes on their teachers, and more specifically their personalities and reactions to certain things. Izuku had spent quite a few days pondering the issue of whether or not to consider their teachers as family or not. Ultimately, they were unable to accurately determine their own feelings on the matter, since they'd never had an extended family before, and thus had no frame of reference as to how close one needed to be to someone to consider them family. The next obvious conclusion had been to test how familiar they could act with everybody before they got uncomfortable. The plan had been to slowly ramp up the level of familiarity over the course of a few weeks so as not to rouse suspicion. Now, 2 weeks into the experiment and things were going surprisingly well. Nobody had said anything, or seemed to be annoyed by Izuku's friendliness. In fact they had adapted, and begun to respond in kind, so while the plan had originally been estimated for about 2 months, it had in fact progressed far more rapidly than Izuku could possibly have predicted. While it took some longer than others, it seemed that almost all of the staff seemed to be perfectly comfortable with the nearly familial closeness that Izuku had been subtly progressing towards. Izuku was taking note of their latest interactions. It was a good thing none of the teachers had realized what they were doing. Nimari was the first to catch on to what Izuku seemed to be up to, but she didn't realize it at the time. Being Shota and Hizashi's best friend, she naturally assumed that she would be Izuku's aunt, so at first the odd looks they would give her every time she talked about it to someone were confusing. Eventually she concluded that maybe she was pushing boundaries just a bit, and backed off. So it was a surprise when Izuku suddenly started being incredibly friendly with her. She thought that maybe they'd finally accepted her as their aunt, and while she wanted to go right back to telling anyone within earshot, Anon had convinced her not to, or rather, they begged her with the promise that they'd listen to her proud and excited rambling when they were at home. So until Izuku outright called her their aunt she was content with silent squeals of joy whenever they approached her to talk. They'd listen to her gossip with keen eyes, probably hunting for more information to go into those notebooks of theirs. While Izuku was busy scribbling notes in their book right after every interaction they had, they probably thought they were being subtle. Nimari found it amusing. She slowly noticed that Izuku had been getting closer to her colleagues as well. Oh well, she doubted that she could reason through whatever odd experiment was going through their mind. Anon was just happy to have someone who was willing to listen to their nerdy ramblings, or, at least, someone new. Their wife and friends had heard their safety lectures and space facts about 10 times over by now, and while they were always happy to listen to Anon, often being genuinely interested in whatever they were saying, it was a different feeling to talk to someone who was learning all of this for the first time. Izuku's eyes always lit up whenever the two of them conversed, and of course, Anon was always happy to listen to their newest analysis, and they were quite happy to give their input as to the possible dangers of the quirks and ways to minimize them, because while Izuku was quite adept at spotting the abilities and limits of the quirks they analyzed, they never really thought of how precisely someone would be able to practice quirk control in a way that would ensure minimum collateral damage. Unlike their wife, they never assumed that Izuku would consider them family, but they'd been pleasantly surprised when they realized just how familiar Izuku was trying to be with them. Then again, they could just have been reading into things, but Nimari had assured them they weren't. It didn't matter really. Anon was content just to hang out with Izuku, whatever they thought of them. Ryo had always been endeared to the young child who seemed so curious and yet so hurt. He could see a bright spark in their heart, but it was shrouded in so much pain. It had taken so long for them to truly come out of their shell and become the bright little genius they all knew and loved. He had tried his best to help them in any way he could, even if it just meant somewhere to hide when things got a bit too loud, and later, be their therapist. As such, he had an intimate knowledge of their past, how well and truly alone they'd been, and the nightmares that plagued them to this day. It was surprisingly easy to get them to open up. He supposed that having one of your closest kept secrets spilt for all to hear on the first day that you meet someone leaves very little for you to hide. He knew their behavior well, and was quick to notice the sudden change in behavior. He always wondered what brought it on, but he was starting to form some suspicions. Ryo wondered if they thought they were being subtle, or perhaps he was at an unfair advantage since most of the methods they were using and questions they were asking were things he had told them around 2 weeks ago when they'd curiously asked how he got his patients to open up to him. He suspected now that they had wanted to learn for the purpose of this study they were conducting. It was quite amusing, really. Ken had always kept some space from Izuku. While he was not trying to avoid them in any way, it just so happened that he wasn't truly able to interact with them. At first it had been because they were just so shy, and later it was simply asking for trouble. While he was glad they had come out of their shell, it seemed that they had gained, or perhaps, stopped hiding, a penchant for mischief. It was rare to find them simply being peaceful. They apparently liked to cause chaos whenever they felt like it. Ken was considered the sanest person on staff at UA, a title that didn't mean much considering the people he was surrounded by. It seemed that every day his colleagues were embroiled in some kind of harebrained nonsense. Not that he tried to stop them, he just didn't get involved. Izuku, on the other hand, was an absolute delight. Even when they were causing trouble, they seemed to be so genuinely polite about it. Apparently they didn't quite realize that the habits of the adults around them were less than normal. Lately Izuku had been showing an interest in literature, and while he was incredibly confused, he welcomed the opportunity to discuss the finer points of poetry with them. Although he had a sneaking suspicion that they were less interested in the actual content of the discussion, and more in simply talking to him, as they have consistently managed to divert the conversation almost every time. Knowing Izuku, this was probably the most roundabout way of accomplishing their goals, but as long as they were trying to be subtle, he wasn't going to correct them. Kazumi didn't like children, at least, the younger ones. There was a reason he only taught the third years. Any younger and they were simply too naive to realize the true dangers they'd face out in the field. Some of that was to be blamed on the teachers, of course. In her opinion, the previous heroics teachers had been too soft. Luckily their replacements, Kan and Aizawa, made it a priority to drill it into their students' heads that they were putting their lives at risk by becoming a hero. Izuku was different. This kid had already been through hell, and they didn't expect much more from the world. So unlike his students, they didn't have a rose-colored view of the world, and that made it significantly less stressful to talk to them about heroics. They were quite enthusiastic, of course, and Kazumi was all too happy to talk at length on the topics of weapon safety and combat strategies. She first noticed their little experiment around a week ago. In hindsight, she really should have noticed it earlier, given the number of times they almost slipped up. It was rather fun to pretend not to have noticed them calling the staff their family on more than one occasion, and then quickly move on, hoping nobody noticed their choice of words. Oh well, at least when they finally admitted it, nobody would be surprised. Hirohito was known to most of the staff as someone who couldn't keep out of trouble. Even while teaching, he would often leave a clone in the teacher's lounge to mess with everyone. All the surprise he'd cause was fully worth the occasions where the others would walk up and poke, or when he was being particularly irritating, punch him, just to make sure he was the real one. So it was no real surprise that Izuku was far more brazen about their troublemaking when they were around him, often telling him of their plans to snoop around, and often going to him for information. They were quite an endearing gremlin, and despite their uncanny ability to sneak around unnoticed, even by a room full of pro-heroes, they seemed to lack any kind of tact. Anyone with a brain could see what they were trying to do, and they all thought that it was adorable that they would go through such lengths rather than simply ask a question. Unlike what most people thought, he could be serious at times, and currently he saw that this was really pointless. Everyone knew what Izuku was doing. He wondered if he should bring it up at some point, rather than letting them run through this whole rigmarole, but every time he tried they simply deflected the question. He supposed he had no choice but to wait it out. Higuri had never been the best at reading people. Z much preferred the company of Zier machines, much more sensible and far less prone to have exceedingly complex social expectations. There were exceptions to that rule, of course. Zier colleagues, For instance, they were always fun to hang around with, and always understood that Z wouldn't take part in anything that Z didn't want to. Another exception was Izuku. They were similar to Zem in so many ways, and perhaps it was that familiarity that allowed Zem to realize precisely what they were up to the second that they started their little experiment. Although they acted far differently with Zem than they did with the rest of the staff, more obvious, Z did appreciate it. Z probably wouldn't have caught on if they didn't, or perhaps they simply overestimated how oblivious Higuri could be. Izuku would often hover around the labs whenever they wanted to speak with Zem, and conversations usually turned to the topic of whatever little creation Higuri was working on at the time. From support gear to weapons, they seemed so genuinely interested that Z promised to teach them how to make their own gear someday. Perhaps Z was getting far more attached than Z had initially realized. Sekijiro never expected Izuku to even consider being friendly with it. From the first day they had shown up, it had kept its distance. After all, it didn't want to scare the poor kid. Soon enough, however, they had approached it with several questions about how its quirk worked, and questions about its hero work, and none of the questions asked had even a hint of judgment or fear, unlike what it was used to from everybody, even its own students. Not that it blamed anybody for being scared, it was already physically imposing, adding on to that its quirk, and well, let's just say it wasn't difficult to see why it chose to go into underground heroics. Still, there was this kid who was half scared of everyone they met, and they still talked to it, and in turn Sekijiro shared stories of its work, and occasionally stories about the times it had worked with Aizawa on cases, which seemed to both amuse Izuku and irritate Aizawa to no end. When it figured out what they were doing, it was definitely confused. There was a variety of reasons for Izuku not to want to get close to it, not least of which being the rivalry it had with their father, although it supposed that could be considered more of a friendly competition. Still, it barely had any idea what to do about the whole situation, but if the kid insisted on being attached, it supposed it didn't mind either. Izuku heard soft whispering as the adults around them conversed about something or another. They were far too focused on their notes to truly care about whatever they were doing. All I'm saying is maybe we should just tell them. Katu's exclamation caused Izuku to look up from their notes only to find everyone staring at them. Why is everyone looking at me? They asked, suddenly very aware of the precious experiment notes on their desk. Sure, none of them could read the code, but they couldn't help but feel shy about the fact that they'd basically been trying to worm their way into the closely knit group that was the UA staff. Ishiyama sighed. Izuku, you're not being as subtle as you think you are. What? Izuku knew what he was implying, but they really didn't want to think that they'd been found out. Seriously, kid, everyone knows about your little experiment. We've just been trying to figure out how to tell you. Kon shook its head in amusement. Oh, Kuros nodded in agreement. Yeah, and, for the record, we're all fine with what you're trying to do. Okay. Now Izuku was definitely dreaming. They bit the inside of their cheek to check. Nope, not a dream. Well, maybe you could quit being so shifty about it, Takeda joked, and Izuku couldn't help but giggle. I guess I was doing things the hard way, again. Izuku grinned. They really should have expected this. Everyone had been so nice. It really was silly of them to go through all of this. Well, at least it worked out in the end, and they had found the answer to their original question, and they could safely say that the teachers at UA fell very firmly within the category of family. Chapter text. Over the last few months, Izuku had come to see UA as their second home. It was only natural. After all, almost all of the staff was their family, Nedzu being the exception as their mentor. The school seemed far less grand than when they first came here a year ago, the feelings of awe and wonder replaced with a sense of cozy familiarity. If you had told them before that they would think going to UA was nothing special, they would probably have thought you were crazy, and yet, here they were, wondering how they ever thought that UA was anything to be awed by. Obviously it was still the best hero school in the country, and they were damn proud to be able to say that they went there almost every day, but they were no longer fawning over every detail. In fact, the intricate workings of the school had faded into the background for them. That wasn't to say that they had tuned it out completely, but they had gotten so used to everything being in certain places that they simply expected things to be the way they were, and any change in that was a little jarring. Case in point, the suspicious-looking spot on the wall just above the floor in one of the hallways where a neon blue splotch about the size of their thumb sat. It could have just been a stain of some kind. Someone's quirk misfired and hit the wall, but they would have known about any incidents like that. Besides, no current students, hero course or otherwise, had a quirk that was even capable of doing something like this, and no matter how bright some students' highlighters were, they most certainly didn't glow. Their next best guess was due to the location of the splotch, which was only a few feet down the hall from classroom 1H. They went through their mental catalog of that class's current projects, and landed on one particular student who had created a tracking paint that was almost impossible to get rid of if you didn't have the solvent. Izuku sighed. They'd have to tell BB Higuri that their students weren't being careful with their projects, and hopefully Z could get the solvent from the student in question. They wandered deeper into the school, slipping into the vents whenever they had to avoid any students who, for one reason or another, weren't in class at the moment. They eventually made their way to Nedzu's office. The doors automatically opened with the familiar creak that played from the almost imperceptible speaker attached to the corner of the wood, and closing behind them when they entered. There was a rumor going around the student body about Nedzu's office being haunted because of those doors. In all fairness to those students, Nedzu had very purposefully made the doors out of wood specifically so that he could pull off this little trick. Nedzu himself was nowhere to be seen. Izuku chalked it up to him having to deal with an important situation somewhere in the school, or he was just spying on some of the classes for the hell of it. It was a 50-50 chance really. So even though they were supposed to be learning from him right now, they settled for cracking open one of their textbooks and doing some of the practice questions. According to Nedzu, they had been learning at an extremely fast pace. They were already learning things from the last year of middle school, not to mention they'd already mastered analysis, and from there Nedzu had moved on to other fields of study, such as battle strategy and psychological trickery. They had been honestly a little unnerved by some of the tactics Nedzu described, but they couldn't deny that they were effective, and some of the more harmless methods were fun to apply to their life, especially when used on their family, most of them anyway. Uncle Ryo never fell for those tricks. Izuku hummed to themselves. They'd been waiting for some time now. It was about time for Nedzu to get back from wherever he'd scurried off to. And right on K, the vent access behind the desk opened up and Nedzu hopped into his chair. "Good afternoon, Izuku. Shall we begin?" Izuku nodded and they opened their notebook, not the one they had their analyses in, although this one was similarly encoded. This one held the notes from these lessons. Nedzu started by quizzing them on the previous lessons, not normal questions. This was Nedzu after all, these were closer to debates. Nedzu would give them a scenario, and they would have to use their current knowledge to make a favorable outcome within a given amount of time. All the while Nedzu would be counter-arguing their points and trying to throw them off, and at the end they'd have to identify the tactics Nedzu had used in his arguments. Alright, this one should be easy. Nedzu smiled sharply. And there was tactic number 1, setting an expectation. Call something easy to do and people get overconfident, or call it hard to do and people get nervous. Either way they start slipping up. Izuku knew better than to fall for that. A raid mission. Your enemy is a large organized crime group of approximately 70 people stationed in a formerly abandoned factory on the south end of Hosu. They are suspected of being behind a string of kidnappings. You have no information about any of the quirks at play. You have 10 minutes to come up with a team and a strategy. Do I have time to do reconnaissance? Unfortunately no, but you do know that most of the people involved are relatively untrained. Izuku nodded, mind racing a mile a minute to think of all the factors at play. Firstly they had to figure out which heroes they'd need on the raid team. It wouldn't be a big team, maybe 4 heroes. It was incredibly irresponsible for whoever was planning the raid not to have any information of the quirks, but they'd work with what they were given. They'd have to use a variety of powers and fighting styles rather than tailoring for any specific threats, not to mention the possibility that the group had the kidnapped victims as hostages. Their first thought was to focus on the heroes who were known to operate in Hosu. Ingenium was an easy choice, quick and precise in combat and able to get any hostages out of danger. Even though factories were closed spaces with lots of clutter and Uncle Tensai was less effective in those, he was capable enough for the job. Manual was also not really an option. He was a fantastic support-focused hero, but they needed the ability to get in and out quickly. And with hostages being a possibility that automatically ruled out endeavor, Izuku's own dislike of the man's attitude aside, he had one of the highest collateral damage rates of any active hero, not to mention that he really didn't play well in a team. 8 minutes left. From there they started thinking about the nearby areas, or heroes that didn't have a set turf. If they were going into this without any recon time, it would be beneficial to have someone who could scout ahead quickly and brief the team of anything. Likely an underground hero, and they'd have to be decently powerful as well. Unfortunately, their mental catalog of underground heroes was limited to the ones who had worked with their dad or Uncle Sekijiro. From that pile, they remembered one called Copycat. She had the power to mimic any emitter or transformation type quirks in her vicinity for a short period of time and, according to Uncle Sekijiro, was very talented at stealth. She was much less active these days on account of her children, but that was a safe bet. And Crimson Riot was always a good choice for combat scenarios, and he would be in the area. Plus he had one of, if not the lowest collateral rates, even counting the one incident in the beginning of his career. 6 minutes. They still needed a medium-range fighter, just in case their enemies had a quirk that made it difficult to get close. Long range was out of the question, once again due to the relatively closed space they'd be fighting in. There was only one other hero who patrolled nearby, in the next city over, and fit the bill, Kamui Woods. He'd only been a hero for 3 years, but he had been steadily climbing the ranks and seemed to be a capable fighter. You have 4 minutes left, Izuku. Tactic 2, Pressure. Izuku had been keeping track of the time in their head. Nedzu knew this, he'd only said that to stress them out. I'd have a team of Copycat, Ingenium, Crimson Riot and Kamui Woods. I'd send in Copycat first to relay basic details and have Crimson Riot lead the charge. Ingenium and Kamui Woods should focus on getting any civilians out of danger and then join the fight. They started confidently. Any hesitation now and Nedzu would pounce on it immediately. And if the group has hostages? Nedzu tilted his head. Both of them were constantly scanning each other's faces and movements for any sign of weakness. It was like a dance, and even though Izuku was still a bit shaky, they could hold their own well enough. Kamui Woods is able to immobilize large groups of people very quickly. I imagine he could deal with that easily, especially if we have Copycat mimic his power for double effectiveness. Another immediate answer. They only had 2.5 minutes left to prove their strategy after all. And if one of your team gets taken out of action, I imagine it would be rather demoralizing, and that would be on your hands if someone died. Izuku paused. Tactic 3. Guilt tripping. Yes, it would be on their conscience if someone got killed, but it wouldn't necessarily be their fault. It would be on the head of whichever villain killed them. Death was a risk of the profession, and something to deal with after the mission was over. If Izuku had a moment, they might have laughed at the fact that they would never have even thought something like that last year. They'd probably have fallen for the trick in an extreme sense, and even now they'd had to stop and reason it out, wasting about 20 seconds. As I was saying, in combat I'd have Crimson Riot at the front, negating most of the offensive options that the villains have, and I'd have Kamui Woods and Copycat behind him acting as support, with Ingenium being the main offensive fighter. 30 seconds left. Nedzu looked Izuku dead in the eyes. Are you sure about your strategy? Tactic 4. Doubt, making them second-guess themselves into wasting time or changing their strategy for a less effective one. Izuku almost paused but knew that they had to answer quickly. No. Given the lack of information, any strategy I come up with will have a million holes, but it's the best I could do on short notice. Their signing was rapid and almost too fast to keep up with as they hurried to answer in the time limit. A small beep signaled that time was up. Izuku visibly relaxed as the stress dissipated. Nedzu simply nodded. That was adequate, although you really need to be a bit better at hiding your emotions, particularly fear, or, at least feign some level of control. I do appreciate that you didn't try and say that your strategy was perfect. Overconfidence has been the downfall of many an empire after all. Izuku grinned at the praise while noting down the suggested improvements in their book. The rest of the lesson was spent learning interrogation techniques, most of which were alright, and some of which Izuku decided were only to be used as last resorts. It was a while after lunch when they decided to sneak their way into the teacher's lounge. If their memory served correct, only Uncle Kazumi, Bibi Higuri and Bibi Anon would be in there at the moment. As they were shuffling through the vents, they noticed that the student who had spilt their project earlier was cleaning up the neon stain. probably hoping that they wouldn't get caught and reprimanded for being careless with their work. They dropped into the teacher's lounge as usual, saying hi to everyone before settling in at their desk. BB Higuri. Izuku looked over to where Z was working. Z hummed to indicate Z was listening. One of your students spilt some of their tracking paint on the wall near the classroom. They cleaned it up, but I figured I should let you know. Z just sighed wearily. Great, it sounds like I'll be doing yet another lab safety lecture. Z wrote it down on their notebook before getting back to work. I can just imagine their shocked face when they realize that you found out, BB Anon giggled. I'll just tell her that the ghost told me, Z said grinning. I mean, it's technically true. Izuku huffed in amusement. The ghost of UA had become a widespread rumor among the student body, after Izuku had accidentally dropped the vent grate into the 1C classroom while they were snooping around. Luckily Papa wasn't there at the time, or he'd probably have given them away by laughing. After that, however, they decided to play up the whole haunting idea just a little bit, making just a little noise whenever they thought it would startle someone. There were even rumors about the ghost being omniscient and that it would tell a teacher if you did something bad, while some argued that they'd done mischievous things without being told on. Actually, Izuku only told on students if their actions put themselves or others in danger, and they never really said anything about harmless fun. Those rumors have actually made those kids behave. It's a miracle really, Uncle Kazumi said. He was looking over the files of his current class, marking down improvements and critiques. He sighed. If only that ghost could make them focus on actually improving themselves. Every sparring session seems to be the same with this lot. I'm tempted to sit 'em all down and lecture 'em until they get it through their heads. If only the ghost could help, Izuku had a suspicion that they definitely could, although, maybe not directly. Uncle Kazumi looked amused at their expression. What is it, chickadee? You look like you've got a bee in your bonnet. Izuku looked at him confused. BB Higuri shook their head. She means you look like you have an idea. Izuku nodded, but refused to elaborate and started writing in their notebook. Everyone looked a little wary at the feral grin that had plastered itself on their face and wisely decided not to ask. After all, they'd never do anything truly harmful. Later that day, a student from Class 3A was joking with her friends. When she opened her desk drawer and found a sealed envelope with a little green ghost drawn in the corner. Her friends cooed that it must be a love letter, maybe from that girl in 3C she had been admiring. She shushed her friends with a giddy grin and opened the letter. Inside was not a love letter. Her face paled as she read each line, a detailed list of just how damaging her energy quirk could be if it grew out of control, from melting everything within a 10-foot radius to actual explosions. It also went into rather horrific detail about the precise nature of the injuries she could cause, and at the bottom where you'd expect the sender's name to be, it was simply signed, a wraith. She knew her quirk was powerful, she had been praised for it her entire life, but she never thought it could be that bad. Even Kuro-sensei's speech hadn't unsettled her this much. Maybe she would focus a little more the next time Kuro-sensei lectured them on quirk control. In another desk in the classroom of 1B, another student finds an envelope. Also with a little green ghost. He'd been having a bad day. Some of his classmates were picking on him for his weak quirk, and he guessed it was true. It wasn't all that powerful. All he could do was make a small illusory creature that he could control and see out of. He'd stopped really paying attention in quirk training, even though Kon-sensei had been pushing him to try a little harder. After all, what good was trying to improve a useless quirk? He opened the envelope cautiously. If it was another trick he was going to cry. The letter inside went into depth about just how versatile his quirk could be if applied to the right situations, that his quirk could be used for recon, or distraction, and that he'd make an excellent stealth and surveillance-focused hero if he practiced increasing the range of his quirk, and maybe if he practiced hard enough he could make bigger creatures which would massively increase his intimidation abilities. He stared at the letter in awe, looking to see who sent it, only to find it was simply signed, a wraith. He smiled. Maybe he could do this after all. Izuku admired their handiwork from the vents. Maybe now those students would start taking things seriously. Soon, all the students would learn what it meant when they found an envelope with a little green ghost. Patrol days were usually the highlights of Izuku's week. Not that they didn't enjoy spending time with their family, but there was something about the simple rush of adrenaline that went through them every time they set off running. The nipping chill of the autumn air was making them extremely grateful that their costume was layered and soft. Eraser had evidently also put some extra layers on underneath his normal costume. The cold was far more noticeable during patrol, while the daytime sun killed some of the chill. Running around at night was a different story, with the wind buffeting at them, latching onto any bit of exposed skin and sending a trill of ice through their limbs. Today seemed to be one of those days, where criminals seemed to be coming out of the woodwork for no reason at all. Days like these were usually the days that they'd come home bruised and exhausted. Luckily, days like these were rare. Days like these also meant that both of them would be a lot less lenient on whatever criminals were stupid enough to put up a fight. Izuku almost felt sorry for them. The other person who would probably be suffering through this night would be Detective Tsukauchi. Most of the other police officers would have been run ragged by the time night fell, and then they'd be stuck with the paperwork for all the arrests, leaving Tsukauchi and any remaining officers to deal with the night shift. Izuku always toned down their tricks on these days. Normally it was fun to annoy any officers or detectives that showed up to arrest whatever criminal they'd caught, but doing that today would just feel like kicking an injured puppy. Around halfway through patrol they had to stop and catch their breath after a fight. It had started normally and then grew progressively more annoying as the criminal they were fighting kept pulling out weapon after weapon from his pockets. Where did he keep getting those? Izuku might have thought it was his quirk if he didn't obviously have a snake mutation. The fight had gotten particularly tough after he managed to hit Eraser with a literal taser. They took him down quickly for that, and if they were a little rougher than normal, and if they broke his nose, well, surely nobody would blame them. Luckily the voltage must have not been that strong because Eraser managed to shake off the shock a little while after that. The fact that the cloth that made up his costume was also mildly insulated probably helped. Wraith, something on your mind? Izuku's eyes were drawn away from the criminal lying prone on the ground. Eraser was looking at them with what some might call anger, or disappointment. Izuku knew better. Dad was looking at them with concern. They took a deep breath and shook their head. Nothing, really. I was just angry. It was an impulse really. Whenever someone hurt the people they cared about, they had to fight to control the red-hot rage that would threaten to drown them. It hadn't really happened before they'd met their parents. Back then they'd only feel sorry. They'd duck their head and try to bend to the whims of the people who hurt them and others. Uncle Rio always said it was because they cared too much, that they would care about someone so much that they took those people's pain and made it their own. That they'd always been angry about the injustices around them. It's just that now they had permission to express it. Izuku knew enough about psychology to know that he was probably right, but that didn't mean that they didn't feel bad about letting that anger take a hold of them. It was difficult to shake off years of being the quiet speck of dirt under everyone's shoes. The police showed up to arrest the criminal, and Izuku did their usual routine of disappearing into the shadows. They really didn't have to. Most of the MPD knew that they existed by now, and that they worked with Eraser, and most of them who'd had the misfortune to encounter them multiple times also knew about their penchant for harmless mischief. But it was fun to pretend like they weren't there, just to see if the officers could spot them before they decided to show themselves. Now Izuku stood on the rooftop. They felt someone pull back their hood and a hand ruffle their hair. They ducked away from a grinning Eraser. They smiled underneath their mask. They probably needed to get a costume that was more than a hoodie, jeans and face mask, but it worked, for now. Good job back there, kid. Pride shined in Eraser's eyes and they beamed. No matter how many times they heard praise, it still made their heart jump. As predicted, patrol ended with both of them covered in minor injuries. Izuku could almost feel the soreness they'd wake up to tomorrow morning. They sighed and stretched, feeling little twinges of pain from where dark purple bruises would soon bloom. Thankfully, their patrol route ended fairly close to home, so it would only be a short while until they could flop into bed and drift off into sweet unconsciousness. They stifled a yawn, or at least they tried to. Eraser huffed out a laugh at their pathetic attempt to look like they weren't practically dead on their feet. They weren't normally this tired after patrol. They figured they'd be taking the slow way. Even though they could function perfectly fine, they knew that their parents would worry if they didn't. Shota watched Wraith try their best to keep up with him, but after only a few meters it was clear that they were probably going to trip over their own 2 feet if they tried to parkour all the way back home. He sighed. They were stubborn, and definitely wouldn't ask for help unless they absolutely had no choice. They really needed to learn when to call it quits and ask for help. In the back of his mind he heard a voice calling him a hypocrite. It sounded suspiciously like Hizashi. He took one look at Wraith before scooping them up and carrying them the rest of the way home, which seemed to be the right call seeing as they had fallen asleep somewhere along the way. It was adorable really, like a little kitten curled up against his chest. The second he stepped into the apartment he heard the clicking of a photo being taken. He looked up to see Hizashi grinning at them with his phone in his hand. Shota smiled at him. "Hey sunshine," he said softly, so as not to wake up their kid. He put them on the couch while Hizashi grabbed the first aid kit. He wasn't really hurt, just a bit frazzled from that incident with the taser, but it never hurt to double check after getting home. Izuku woke up for long enough to make sure they weren't too heavily injured. They only had a few scratches on their arm. They smiled sleepily at Hizashi as he put plasters over the cuts. Shota looked over their arm. Their skin was a patchwork of scars. Some were more faded than others. The injuries they gained tonight wouldn't scar. Then again, it would be difficult to tell when the scars overlapped like that. Izuku would know. They had their scars memorized. They could tell anyone exactly where they got each and every one of their scars. Shota hoped they'd never have to add to that list of tales. Hizashi finished patching them up and ruffled their hair affectionately. He turned to put away the first aid kit. "Good night Izuku," Hizashi said as Izuku drifted back to sleep. "Night." If Shota wasn't right next to the couch he might have not heard the quiet sound. It was half a word. The voice was stuttering and soft from both sleep and years of disuse. And if there wasn't only one possibility of who spoke, Shota would never have recognized it, having only heard quiet giggles or little noises from them before. Hizashi hadn't noticed it yet. "Izuku, kid," Shota looked at them incredulously. They blinked their eyes sleepily and made a confused noise, apparently not having realized what they'd said. Hizashi also looked confused at his sudden alertness. "What's going on, love?" "Izuku, could you repeat what you said?" Shota said as gently as possible. "What I said." Izuku still looked confused. Shota shook his head. "Never mind, I guess it was just because you were tired." "What, kid, you spoke." Izuku was fully alert now. They spoke. Their head was spinning. They hadn't even tried to speak for a long time now. They must have been so tired that their mouth simply moved on its own. Izuku repeatedly opened and closed their mouth. They searched for that tightness that would wrap their throat whenever they tried to speak around people like a snake stealing their words. It wasn't there. They could breathe. Thinking back, they hadn't felt that tightness for a while now. Maybe they had just gotten so used to not speaking that they hadn't noticed when they were able to speak. Hell yo. They could hardly recognize their own voice, and their stutter was present in full force, whether because they were nervous or because they just hadn't used their voice in 4.5 years. They could see their parents' eyes shine. Dad reached out and ruffled their hair, and Papa was smiling softly. They tried again, but their throat was starting to hurt. They frowned. "You don't have to speak if it's difficult," Papa said gently, sitting on the other side of them and pulling them into a loose hug which Dad quickly joined. They nodded and went quiet, nuzzling into the hug. They didn't really know why the tightness had gone away. Maybe Uncle Ryo would be able to tell them, but for now they returned to sleep. "Dad, Papa, yeah little listener, L-O-V-Y-O-U," they stuttered through their words but they meant every syllable. They felt their parents' hug tighten just a little as they both spoke at the same time. "We love you too Izuku." To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.